Chapter 311. Giggle. What a handsome child. I'm tempted. The seductive voice seemed to be able to bewitch people. Lingli looked tense and forcibly suppressed his heart, which was aroused by the tone. He stared at the graceful figure that suddenly appeared in front of him. Under the pale green light, a familiar but strange face came into view. You are? Lingli thought of the owner of this face and looked slightly serious. Su Zipei? The face of the woman in front of him was exactly the same as that of Su Zipei, who had been reduced to a slave. Was it a coincidence or, well, Su Zipei, I have some impression of you. The woman tilted her head in confusion and touched her cheek with her nails. Then Lingli saw that her nails were more than an inch long and glowed with unusual metallic luster. Could these nails belong to human beings? Lingli felt cold. Su Zipei suddenly laughed out. I remember. The Su Zipei you were talking about, isn't it the blood food that I ate a few days ago? A human girl of 17 or 18 years old is really delicious. Eating human beings? Su Zipei was dead? Lingli's pupils shrank, and he subconsciously stepped back a few steps. Suddenly, there was nothing under his feet. When he was about to step back to the stone path, Su Zipei suddenly rushed to him at a very fast speed like a ghost with a twisted smile on her face. Her hands were about to touch Lingli's chest. Go away. Lingli's eyes were sharp and he slapped Su Zipei in the air. Su Zipei took the slap and continued to rush to him as if nothing had happened. Helplessly, Lingli simply rushed back and fell into the pit like a meteor. Crack, crack, crack. At the bottom of the pit, the white bones piled up like a mountain. Lingli's figure sank into the bone mountain like a meteor and crushed a large number of bones. For a time, the sound was continuous. After a while, Lingli, whose clothes were a little damaged, appeared from the bones. He gasped slightly and ran the Qigong method to float on the surface of the fragile bone mountain. He glanced at the sea of white bones in the vast cave, and a hint of horror flashed in his eyes. There were so many bones. There were no less than 100,000. Were these people bloody food of the mysterious woman just now? What exactly was it? Lingli didn't have time to think too much. Suddenly, there was a slight sound of breaking the air behind him. He hurriedly turned back and raised his sword to block. Ding! The sound of gold and iron was almost ear-piercing. A terrifying force hit the sword. Almost instantly, the inherited sword of the Enma cult in Lingli's hand was broken into several pieces. His body flew backward like a cannonball and hit the hard mountain wall with a bang. He spat out a mouthful of blood. What kind of power was this? Ha 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 ha. What fresh blood food. Su Zipei rushed to the blood-stained mountain wall like a madman and stuck out his tongue to lick it. When Lingli saw this scene, he felt disgusted and almost vomited blood. He barely stood up. He didn't care that this movement would aggravate his injury. He stared at the hole in the mountain wall and burst out the fastest speed. His figure flew out like a shadow. Run. He had to escape. He wasn't a match for this monster. Stubbornly resisting would only result in his death. He was fast, but Su Zipei was faster. She appeared in front of Lingli in a flash and slapped Lingli into the ground again with a sneer. Boom! The ground exploded and a human-shaped hole appeared. This time, it took Lingli 15 minutes to climb out of the sea of bones. He breathed heavily and was stained with blood. His eyes were full of unwillingness. Could it be that he was really going to die here for no reason? Child, how can you leave me? Lingli felt a weight on his shoulder, and the seductive voice suddenly sounded in his ear. He sensed that Su Zipei breathed out and immediately got goosebumps on his neck. The soft body of Su Zipei climbed to Lingli's chest. This time, Lingli was seriously injured and had no strength to avoid it. Looking at Su Zipei at such a close distance, Lingli saw that her pupils were vertical, which reminded him of a terrible creature instantly. Su Zipei looked at Lingli with her bright green eyes. Her eyes were full of excitement and fascination. Her long nails scratched Lingli's face, and then she gently leaned on his chest. Listening to the powerful heartbeat, she sighed with satisfaction. It's really a perfect blood food. You are not only beautiful, but also so pure and delicious. I really don't want to eat you, Su Zipei said and suddenly exerted force. Ling Li groaned, and a piece of flesh was dug out. Suzy Pei ate it and licked the blood on her nails. Suzy Pei didn't forget to eat it. Disgusting. Get away. Ling Li's forehead was full of cold sweat because of the pain. He was powerless to push away the increasingly heavy body of Suzy Pei. You are not a human being. Is there really a monster in the world? The bright smile on the face of Suzy Pei suddenly froze. She became furious and scratched 5 bloody marks on Ling Li's chest. Monster? How could I be a monster? I am a god. I am the most ancient snake god in the world. If I didn't believe in your human clan, how could I be trapped in this remote place? I can't even find a decent blood food. How could I rely on devouring the lowly human clan to maintain my life? Unforgivable. Boom. The boundless and horrible momentum burst out. Ling Li and the bones under him were instantly thrown far away. The strong force hit Ling Li's seriously injured body. He suddenly blacked out and lost consciousness. At the same time, Su Li, who had just arrived at the sweet alley, changed her expression. She punched the ground without hesitation and went underground. After a long time, the movement in the underground cave finally subsided. Suzy Pei stood in the center of the extremely clean circular open space with disheveled hair. Suddenly, she came to herself and said, "Blood food. Where is my blood food?" She immediately rushed into the bones, and countless bones were blasted into powder. Within a few breaths, she found Ling Li, who had fainted. Sensing the vitality in Ling Li's body, Suzy Pei breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Fortunately, he is still alive. Otherwise, he will not be fresh." Then, she tore Ling Li's clothes very quickly. Soon, Ling Li was naked. "Haha, you have such a good figure. I can only enjoy it once. I am really reluctant." The green pupils of Suzy Pei gradually turned pink. At the same time, she slightly opened her mouth and spat out a pink air mass. As soon as the air mass touched Ling Li's skin, it immediately penetrated into his body like a living thing. Then, just for a moment, a restless pneuma slowly emerged from Ling Li's body. Seeing this scene, Suzy Pei smiled charmingly and said, "Let me serve you well." Just when her red lips were about to touch Ling Li's face, a monstrous killing intent like a mountain torrent suddenly broke out behind her. Suzy Pei's expression suddenly changed. Before she could respond, a white palm had been printed on her back, and then, boom! A blast 10 times more terrible than before broke out. Suzy Pei was like an ant blown away by a seal. In the blink of an eye, she was hit dozens of feet away and crashed into the hard mountain rock, leaving a human-shaped hole. In the fierce wind, Su Li's eyes were full of killing intent. She floated over and held Ling Li, who was in a coma, with one hand to block the remaining impact for him. Then she pointed at Ling Li's major acupoints with her fingertips to seal his pneuma and blood to protect his life. Suddenly, Su Li's eyes were fixed. She saw a bloody hole in Ling Li's chest. The extinguished anger in her heart immediately boiled. She flashed and appeared in front of Suzy Pei. Suzy Pei just struggled out of the mountain rock. She only felt a black shadow flashed in front of her. Then she felt a sharp pain on her right face. She was thrown far away and fell heavily into the sea of bones. After a long time, she climbed up and screamed angrily, "Which family are you from? How dare you ruin my plan? Could it be that you've forgotten the ancient agreement?" Before she finished her words, Su Li was expressionless. She flashed and slapped Suzy Pei again. Suzy Pei spat blood, and her sharp teeth fell out. "What ancient agreement? You dare to attack Ling Li. You are courting death." While speaking, Su Li's eyes flashed with killing intent. Her 5 fingers were like claws and penetrated the chest of Suzy Pei, bringing out a large number of internal organs and snake scales. Suzy Pei spat out a lot of blood and held Su Li's arm in horror. "I remember. You are Su Li, the sister of this bloody food. You are not an ancient person. No wonder. Go to hell." Chapter 312. The Bone Sea Cave, which was like a gust of wind, fell into silence at this moment. Su Li withdrew her fingertips from the glabella of Suzy Pei. The latter immediately fell to the ground and foamed at the mouth. Soon, there was no sound. Then, with a bang, the body of the giant dark green snake appeared. A member of the demon race who had lived for who knew how many years had died just like that. Suli frowned and felt that the foundation in her wrist was reduced by 1,000. This battle seemed easy, but in fact, she had burst out the greatest combat power, so that she could seriously injure the snake demon. Returning to Lingli, who was still naked, Suli knelt and sat on the side. Her expression was a little uncertain. What she used just now was the secret method from her memory, the soul-searching skill. As the name suggested, this skill could explore other people's primordial spirit and memory. It was also applicable to the demon. However, after using it, the person who was affected by it would either die or become stupid. Suzipe was obviously unlucky and died directly. Suli, who got her memory, knew her name at this moment. It was Baijan. She also vaguely understood the cause of her death. It was probably because the demon soul had been seriously injured a long time ago. It was incomplete, so it was a little crazy and abnormal. As for other memories, most of them were chaotic. She hadn't fully recovered her memory, so she couldn't see the reason for a while. What really annoyed her now was the red mist that Baijan spat to Lingli just now. Snakes were extremely lascivious. If Baijan's memory was correct, the red mist was a strong poison used by the demon snake clan to seduce men. It couldn't be removed by ordinary means. The only way was thinking of this. Suli struggled. She was about to die. If she really did it with Lingli, what would Lingli do after she left? At this moment, she still didn't think about herself, but Lingli's feelings. Perhaps for Suli, death was coming. What was the use of keeping a pure body? Maybe I can. All kinds of complicated thoughts emerged in Suli's mind. Then, at a certain moment, when the handsome boy lying in front of her groaned like a beast, the girl, who was pale all year round, finally blushed. She gently untied the belt around her waist and bent down. Roar! At the edge of the dark green snake mountain in the sea of white bones, two figures were entangled with each other. All sorts of indescribable sounds echoed. After a long time, the darkness passed and Lingli opened his eyes blankly. Suddenly, he sat up and touched his body. He found that his clothes were still intact and the wound on his chest had been carefully bandaged. Is it a dream? Lingli breathed a sigh of relief and immediately blushed. How could he have such a dream with Suli? Was it because he was too hungry? After thinking for a moment, Lingli's sight gradually returned. At a glance, he saw the dark green corpse as huge as a mountain. He was shocked and stood up. Then he remembered the situation before he passed out. Not a dream. Lingli's heart tightened, and he couldn't help but feel his whole body carefully. As expected, he felt a trace of feeling in his lower body. He and this snake, thinking of the weight of his body in a coma and the constant twisting touch, Lingli's face immediately became ugly as if he had eaten a fly. Hierarch Ling, what are you thinking? There was a sudden voice behind him. The voice was so close that it sounded in his ears. Lingli suddenly came to himself. He saw a young man in cyan clothes with an inexplicable smile on his face. Mr. Li? Lingli whispered in surprise. How could this person appear? And he looked back at the snake monster that had been dead for a long time. There was a glimmer of hope in his heart. He asked a little eagerly, "Thank you, Mr. Li. You saved me again. If I may be so bold, may I ask if did you have sex with the snake monster?" The young man in cyan clothes took over the topic, but said with a faint smile, "Hierarch Ling should know best whether I did or not." Hearing this tacit acquiescence, Lingli was completely silent. He was really confused and didn't know what to do. So, how could he go back to Sealy? You should be lucky. If I didn't sense the abnormality and come in time, you would have become one of these bones. Let's go up first. Your subordinates should be waiting for a long time. Lingli was stunned and nodded to follow the young man. He was absent-minded all the way, so he didn't find that the young man in cyan clothes in front of him walked unnaturally. When they arrived at the entrance of the stone path, Suli had completely suppressed the trace of unnaturalness. Ling Qinglan and others saw them come out. They were surprised that Mr. Li was also here. Then they saw the blood on Lingli's body. They were shocked and surrounded him immediately. Hierarch. Master. Lingli, how are you? Ling Qinglan spoke last. When he saw Su Li in the iconic cyan clothes, he immediately cupped his hands respectfully and said, Mr. Li, why are you here? Su Li smiled slightly and didn't answer. Ling Li came to his mind and waved his hand to answer for Su Li. I was careless this time. I didn't expect that there was such a horrible thing hidden here. If Mr. Li didn't save me in time, I am afraid. Ling Qinglan was suddenly horrified. Even Ling Li said it was horrible. How powerful was the thing below? It's over. It's useless to say more. Su Li said softly and turned to look at Ling Li. She said quietly, I think that after this experience, Hierarch Ling should understand some taboos. I have a suggestion, but I don't know whether I should say it or not. Mr. Li, please say it. Ling Li cupped his hands slightly. The owner of the Linli building had saved him several times and completely eliminated his hostility. Of course, the premise was that he didn't covet Su Li. If possible, the fewer people know about the thing below the ground, the better. You know, there is more than one taboo in the world, and the number may be beyond the imagination of Hierarch. If they know that the snake is dead, they will definitely associate it with something. At that time, there will be a lot of trouble. When Su Li said this, Ling Li was suddenly shocked. He had really felt the strength of the snake demon. Even if he sacrificed the lives of the people of the Enma cult, he couldn't compete with it. If there was another one, it would be a disaster. Who could guarantee that Mr. Li could come in time next time? Although he didn't know why Mr. Li could save him every time, he couldn't entrust his life to a stranger who had nothing to do with him. I will keep in mind what Mr. Li said. Su Li nodded and said, Let me give you another advice. The Enma cult is not constrained now. I am afraid that they will attack the Dongfang family soon. However, if Hierarch Ling can, please listen to me and attack them later. Ling Li was shocked. How could this person know everything? Even in the Enma cult, only a few people knew that he would attack the Dongfang family. He even hid it from the people of the Elder Mountain. Su Li noticed that Ling Li's expression was different. She couldn't help but smile. It is not difficult to guess what Hierarch Ling is thinking. That's all I have to say. It depends on Hierarch Ling's opinion whether to accept it or not. I have something to do, so I will leave now. Then, Ling Qinglan and others were about to make a fist and palm salute to say goodbye. Su Li turned around and left without stopping. Ling Imo and others were confused. Why did Mr. Li leave in a hurry? Was it urgent? Ling Li didn't care about Su Li's strange departure. At this moment, he was in a mess and had no time to be distracted. After standing for a moment, he gently breathed out and sighed. Let's go back to the Enma cult first. Don't go back directly? Ling Qinglan wondered. You have been out for a long time. Su Li. As soon as he heard Su Li's name, Ling Li was slightly shocked. He immediately looked at his blood-stained body with a little disgust. I have to take a good bath first. Ling Qinglan nodded. Although it was strange that she had to go back to the headquarters for something that could be solved on the road, he didn't think much. At present, everyone had fought hard. It was good to go to the headquarters to have a rest. Su Li swept to the spiritual realm. Finally, she couldn't stand it and spat blood on the stone pillar of the broken temple. Such a movement suddenly made the boundary ripple. Then Chu Xiao came through the boundary with a shocked face. He supported Su Li and said in a panic, Highly great master, what's wrong with you? Who hurt you like this? Su Li shook her head and suppressed the sharp pain in her heart. She gritted her teeth and said, Let's go in first. Chu Xiao didn't dare to delay. He quickly took Su Li into the spiritual realm and took her all the way to the top attic. Don't let anyone disturb me. After Chu Xiao left, the room was quiet again. Su Li had time to concentrate on running the Ghost Valley meditation direction to suppress the boiling thing in her body. This thing was nothing else but the blood elixir that flew out from Lin Yinxing's eyebrows and entered her body. For more than a year, this thing had never moved, which almost made Su Li forget its existence. But when she lost her chastity to Ling Li, this thing suddenly began to crazily impact in her body. It seemed that this body was no longer a qualified habitat. If it was in normal days, she would let it go. but she clearly felt that this thing had absorbed all the remaining foundation in her body. If it left her body, she would definitely die. So, she could only struggle to not let it break the surface of her body. Time became longer and longer in the suffering. She didn't know how long it had been. Her consciousness was blurred under the severe pain. Finally, there was a familiar voice in her ear. "Master, what's wrong with you? Don't scare me." It was Jing Xian's voice. It seemed that she was crying. This girl should have the inheritance left by Bloodlord in her body. No wonder. The old beggar's voice sounded one after another, followed by a ghostly voice. Things have come to this. Although the tactical matrix has not been fully prepared, we can only bite the bullet and do it. Ha ha ha. The day has finally come. Apprentice, although the tactical matrix of reincarnation I prepared for you is not perfect, the blood elixir in your body can also help you. Now is the best time. Whether you can win a chance of survival depends on yourself. Chapter 313. In the muddle-headedness, time lost its meaning. At the beginning, Su Li could only concentrate on resisting the severe pain, and then gradually became numb. Finally, she had spare energy to touch the thought passed by Qi Xianqing. As soon as she touched it, Qi Xianqing's hoarse voice sounded in her heart. The tactical matrix of reincarnation is a secret of our ghost clan. Although it is the most precious treasure of our clan, it can be applied to anyone. Its only function is to turn the dead to life. The price is high, so we can't use this method at ordinary times. This time, you capture people from the outside world. Although I don't know your intention, I gradually have an idea. If so many life rings are broken together, the vitality gathered is enough to start the matrix. The process of changing fate must be painful, and ordinary people can't bear it. But if you persist, not only your life will be safe, but also your talent and luck will be greatly improved. And with this matrix, you will not be controlled by the reincarnation mirror. At that time, you can break through the boundary and control your own fate. Rebirth from the dead and change fate. Su Li's soul set off a violent fluctuation. Qi Xianqing and the old beggar, who maintained the tactical matrix outside, immediately felt it. They immediately looked up, but Su Li still closed her eyes, and there was no sign of waking up. "Old ghost, don't be too anxious. It has only been a month, and this girl's soul consciousness has responded. It shows that her will is firm and tenacious, which is still above our expectation." Qi Xianqing showed a gratified smile, but in the eyes of the old beggar, it was a weird smile, which made the old beggar couldn't help but murmur that he deserved to be an old ghost who had lived for many years. "Are the little kids who follow Su Li still outside?" Qi Xianqing suddenly said, and the old beggar nodded slightly. "Yes, the group of people under Su Li are loyal, which is quite rare." Qi Xianqing immediately sneered and said, "That's because they are lucky. I hate betrayal most in my life. If someone dares to leave Su Li, I will personally kill him." The old beggar opened his mouth in surprise and finally didn't know what to say. He could only shake his head and sigh. "Madman, you are a complete madman. I don't know whether it is right or wrong to cooperate with you." Qi Xianqing smiled grimly. "I just want a future for Ghost Clan, and you just want to escape. We both take what we need. What's wrong?" Even so, the old beggar looked worriedly at Su Li, who was still suffering in the tactical matrix. No one had ever taken this road. Could Su Li really succeed? At the same time, outside the tactical matrix of the spiritual realm, Fang Yuan and other senior executives of the Linli building gathered here. Everyone looked gloomy, especially Fang Yuan, who was the leader. His face was so gloomy that even Luo Yichen, who stood beside him, felt a pressure. Not long ago, Fang Yuan broke through. Even Fang Yuan himself was surprised by the breakthrough this time. But everything went smoothly. He became the first practitioner of the longevity realm in the core of the Linli building before Luo Yichen without any hindrance. But when Fang Yuan was about to tell Su Li joyfully, he learned that Su Li's condition changed again. She was healing in the spiritual realm. When he hurried here, he knew that Su Li was not facing a small crisis at all, but a big crisis concerning life and death. Moreover, he couldn't help her. When he learned that this matter might be related to Lingli, He flew to the Ling mansion with a murderous look. Chu Qingning wanted to stop him but was seriously injured by him. Other people were not much better. It was a mess. Finally, Jing Xian calmed him down. Later, all the people of the Linli building arrived. They sat on the ground outside the gate of the tactical matrix of the spiritual realm and waited for Su Li to come out. Or another result. In front of the gate, Jing Xian stood in silence with a worried look. Since Su Li entered the tactical matrix, she had been standing here and never left. As for the spirit outside, there was an ancient existence involved in this matter, so she didn't need to be distracted. At this moment, Chu Xiao cautiously walked to her and whispered in her ear, "Great Master." After the disappearance of the first Great Master, the Enma cult made frequent movements. It seems that there is a tendency to break out. Jing Xian narrowed her eyes slightly and pondered. Her expression and reaction were very similar to Su Li's. I didn't expect that Ling Li loved the master so deeply. Just a month or so, he couldn't help it. Speaking of this, Jing Xian's voice lowered. Chu Xiao stood aside and didn't dare to disturb her. After a while, Jing Xian slightly raised her head and whispered, "This is a critical time. The less the turmoil, the less likely the master will be affected. You send someone to warn him, but don't tell him the truth, in case Ling Li loses his mind and makes a big trouble." Speaking of this, Jing Xian's eyes became cold. At the same time, let Yu Wuhai go to the Shaoshan Palace and warn him. I believe that as long as he is not stupid, he will not fight against the Linli building, which is guarded by two ancient existences. The Dongfang family is just a chess piece. It's okay to abandon it. I'll do it right away. In the Ling mansion, Hierarch Ling, listen to me. If you continue to make trouble, it will not do any good to Miss Su. Miss Su is now in a critical period and needs absolute stability. If you insist at this time, I'm afraid that Miss Su will fall into eternal damnation. That's all I have to say. Hierarch Ling, take care of yourself." After Chu Xiao said the last sentence, his figure disappeared, leaving only silence in the study. "Master," Ling Mo's voice broke the silence. Ling Li took a deep breath, as if he was suppressing something. He said coldly, "Go and ask Zhang Laoshan's men to do it. I want all the information about the identity of the man." Seeing Ling Li give up the previous idea, Ling Mo breathed a sigh of relief and turned away. After Ling Mo left, there was only Ling Li in the study. He looked at the soft chair under the bookshelf where Su Li often sat and was lost in thought. Why did Su Li suddenly disappear? Was it because she knew what he did underground, so she left angrily? At first, he thought so. But when he found that the restaurant of the Linli building was closed for half a month, he finally realized that something was wrong. Why did the Linli building also disappear when Su Li disappeared? Did Mr. Li take action? When he thought of Mr. Li's desperate strength, he was out of balance and immediately sent more people to inquire about any news about the Linli building. At that time, Su Li disappeared, and the Linli building was a little chaotic. Ling Li even found some clues. It turned out that it was not the Hahuan sect that destroyed the Nanjiang country, but the Linli building. Not only that, even the two major forces of the Tianji country and the Ghost Valley and the Wanjin sect in the spiritual circle also fell into the hands of the Linli building. The masters controlled by Mr. Li were far more powerful than any other forces in the world. Even the Shaoshan Palace could not compare with them. Why did he want so many forces? Ling Li continued to investigate and even arrested several high-level people in the Linli building, but he got nothing. Ling Li almost went crazy when he didn't get the news of Su Li for a long time, so he made a very crazy decision. He would attack the Dahan country controlled by the Dongfang family in advance. Only in this way could he broaden the clues and find Su Li. In this regard, although Ling Qinglan and others tried their best, it was useless. The Enma cult immediately entered the stage of war preparation, but before the plan was tried, Chu Xiao came to them automatically. For the safety of Su Li, the plan had to be temporarily suspended, but Ling Li would not trust others easily. As long as he found some news about Chu Xiao, he would immediately go to find out the truth. It would be best if he could find Su Li, but if not, Ling Li's eyes flashed crazily. Suddenly, a voice came from outside the door, and it was extremely urgent. "Li, is there any news about Li?" It was Chiu Ming who came in. At this moment, her face was pale, and there were still tears in her eyes. Obviously, she had worried a lot about Suli in the past 2 days. Lingli tightened his lips and thought of Chu Xiao, but he didn't say anything and just shook his head. It would only make people more disappointed if he said something that had not been confirmed. What should we do? Xiao Ming was so anxious that she frowned and said, "How could such a big living person disappear? Is she tired of living here and sneaked away somewhere?" "Impossible." Lingli pinched the wheelchair with his fingers and said firmly, "Li has been well-behaved these years and has never been out of the Ling mansion. If she wants to leave, how can there be no sign? She must be delayed by something." Xiao Ming was shocked by Ling Li's momentum. She secretly thought that her youngest son was just a loafer. How could his momentum be stronger than that of his second brother? But she didn't think much and quickly comforted him. Yes, it must be so. I will urge Qinglan to send more people and all the guards in our mansion." Lingli responded and closed his eyes painfully. He even sent most of the people in the Yinma cult. What was the use of the few people in the Ling mansion? Now he could only hope that what Chu Xiao said was true. When the time came, Suli would come back by herself. Strength. I need strength. If my strength is equal to Mr. Li's, I can go anywhere in the world. I don't need to worry that I can't find Suli. Lingli roared crazily in his heart, but more than that, he felt a sense of powerlessness. Waiting and suffering were equally long. This year was extremely torturous for Lingli, Dongfang Rue, Qi Xianqing, and the people of the Linli building. The tactical matrix was not finished. In the middle of operation, the blood of the life ring in the tactical matrix gathered to the center and completely wrapped Suli, forming a blood cocoon. No one could see the situation inside, including the 2 old guys. But for the common people and cultivators, this year was an extremely lucky year, because no matter which realm the forces were in, they were all incomparably well behaved. It was as if there was a force that was deterring them, preventing them from acting recklessly. This phenomenon became more and more obvious after the spiritual realm sent people to eliminate a troublesome force. In a blink of an eye, 10 months passed. Chapter 314. Rumble. The blood-colored tactical matrix that covered hundreds of feet shook. As time went by, the magnitude of the vibration became greater and greater. Cracks appeared and extended to the feet of Qi Xianqing and the old beggar. What's the matter? The old beggar's pneuma was much worse than 10 months ago. He looked at Qi Xianqing, who was also weak, with surprise and doubt, but he saw that the latter frowned. It was the first time to drive the tactical matrix of reincarnation in such a way. How could he know the changes? Boom, boom, boom. The movement of the tactical matrix was getting greater and greater. A large number of tactical matrix patterns were broken during the vibration, and the pneuma also had the tendency to spread out. Qi Xianqing and the old beggar had no choice but to suppress it. But no matter how the tactical matrix shook, the blood cocoon in the center of the tactical matrix was still motionless. Failed. The old beggar's face was slightly pale. The matrix patterns were broken, which meant that the tactical matrix stopped running and the blood cocoon was still motionless. There was only one result. That was, the person in the tactical matrix was dead. Qi Xianqing, you said 60 or 70%. What about me? This tactical matrix has cost us 10,000 years of life. How can we just let it go? Qi Xianqing's face was gloomy, and he didn't speak. His gray eyes stared at the blood cocoon. He didn't believe that Suli, who had always been determined, could not bear the pain and died. Well, it's fate. The old beggar saw that the blood cocoon in the middle of the tactical matrix also began to peel off and be damaged. He couldn't help but sigh and withdrew his means. This place is about to collapse, and the movement will not be small. In order to prevent the mirror spirit from noticing, we should leave early. Qi Xianqing seemed not to hear it and still stared at the blood cocoon. The free and easy old beggar, who always laughed at the world of mortals and didn't care about anything, finally became angry. Suddenly, there was a tearing sound like cloth. Although the sound was very small, it could not escape the ears of the 2 old guys. Qi Xianqing's eyes instantly brightened. Then, He saw a pale hand stretched out from the crack of the blood cocoon, and then tore it hard. Ha 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 ha. Success. The smile on Qi Xinqing's face couldn't stop expanding, and the old beggar was also surprised. He stared at the figure slowly struggling out of the blood cocoon, for fear of missing any details. But after Su Li completely got out of the blood cocoon, Qi Xinqing saw a mass of blood in her arms, and the smile on his face immediately froze. What was that? When Su Li saw the two dispirited old people, there was a slight fluctuation in her eyes, but it soon calmed down. 10 months was enough for her to understand many things. This included why the two ancient existences in front of him seemed to have suffered heavy injuries, and their auras were weak. The tens of thousands of life rings alone only occupied 70% of the resources of the heavenly isolation formation, and the other 30% came from these two people. From their expressions, it could be seen how much they had paid to operate the formation. Unfortunately, I failed. Su Li suddenly opened her mouth. Her voice was hard and harsh, as if her throat had been seriously hurt. It was not as pleasant as usual. Failed? The old beggar's expression changed slightly. He moved closer and said, "You can come out alive. How could you?" Before he finished his words, he finally saw what Su Li was holding in her arms. To be exact, it was a bloody swaddle. In the swaddling clothes, a baby that looked like it was carved from jade was sleeping peacefully. It was as if this embrace, which was filled with the smell of blood, was the most peaceful place in the world. A newborn child? The old beggar exclaimed. How could you have a child? Although he was in the dark, Su Li's activities in these years had always been in his eyes. Su Li had never consummated with Ling Li. How could she be pregnant? Before the old beggar's question was answered, Qi Xianqing, whose eyes were faintly red, finally said angrily, "You gave all the opportunities to him? Do you know what it means?" "Do you know?" "I know." Su Li looked calm. She reached out and gently stroked the delicate cheek of the child in her arms. A trace of tenderness flashed in her eyes. "I failed, but you didn't fail. Raise him well, and you can still get out of here." Su Li. A loud shout seemed to exhaust Qi Xinqing's remaining strength. He was full of sorrow, but looking at Su Li's peaceful face, he didn't know what to say. Although they were not of the same clan, he used Su Li in this plan. Everything he did might be selfish, but Su Li was definitely the one who benefited the most in the end. But now, in the illusion, even if you give birth, you'll only get the soul from the outside world. He's not your son at all. You're giving this opportunity to others just like that. Don't tell me that I'm old and muddled, and you're muddled too? Master. Su Li looked at Qi Xianqing, who almost wanted to strangle the baby in her arms. She called him sincerely for the first time, which made him shocked. His eyes filled with anger restored calmness. Good. I will give you a chance. If you can't convince me, I will kill the child in your arms. Sensing the unquestionable emotion in Qi Xinqing's words, Su Li smiled slightly. She glanced at the old beggar who was listening and called softly, "Jing Xian." As the voice fell, a rainbow light came, and Jing Xian was surprised. "Master, you succeeded?" Su Li shook her head. "Go to eliminate the movement of the tactical matrix and prepare a quiet room." Jing Xian was slightly stunned. Seeing the swaddle in Su Li's arms, although she had many doubts, she did as she was told. A moment later, in the quiet room, "Master, there is one thing you are wrong about." Su Li gently put down the swaddle in her arms. The baby immediately stretched out his hands uncomfortably, as if he wanted to grasp something. "One thing I can be sure of is that he is my son. He is a newborn soul, not from the outside world." Hearing Su Li's words, Qi Xianqing suddenly frowned, but he didn't get angry. He pointed at the baby's naguan. After a long time, there was no abnormal phenomenon. No life ring. The old beggar was suddenly shocked and stood up. "Is it a creature in the illusion? But it is not right. Girl, you are from the outside world. According to the law of reincarnation mirror, your offspring in this world will inevitably choose a soul from any life ring in the outside world to integrate with it. How can a new soul appear?" Su Li glanced at Qi Xianqing, who was thoughtful, and shook her head. Senior, did you forget my identity? The old beggar was stunned, and then his eyes suddenly shook. He pointed at Su Li and said unbelievably, "You changed the law of reincarnation mirror and succeeded. Doesn't that mean?" Su Li shook her head and said, "Senior, you think too highly of me. At best, I am just a lonely ghost with a little authority. How can I change the law of reincarnation mirror? This time, I just broke through the shackles with the help of the big tactical matrix. If there is no big tactical matrix, I can't do it even if I try my best." I see. The old beggar was enlightened, and his eyes focused on the sleeping baby. His pair of turbid eyes gradually shone. Can this child really take us out of reincarnation mirror? Su Li smiled slightly. If the prediction of the seniors is right, it is reasonable. Let's not talk about this first. Qi Xianqing suddenly opened his mouth, and his face was faintly irritable. He stared at Su Li's pale face and said in a deep voice, "Disciple, tell me the truth. How much time is left?" The old beggar reacted quickly when he heard the words, and his eyes moved from the baby to Su Li, who had been smiling and acting as if nothing had happened. "If you didn't say it, I would have ignored it. You are haunted by the blood elixir in your body, and now you give all the opportunities of tactical matrix of reincarnation to your son. How can you survive?" There was a silence in response to him. The atmosphere in the addendum immediately became heavy. Qi Xianqing patted the table impatiently. Finally, in the astonished eyes of the old beggar, he asked repeatedly, "Why? Is it so disgusting to be my apprentice that you don't even hesitate to die? Or do you not want to live at all? Now you have a son, which is just what you want." Su Li was still silent. She stretched out her fingers and gently teased the baby, who was less than a month old in swaddling clothes. The pain in the blood cocoon, as the life ring invaded little by little, was like the torture of thousands of snakes. Even now thinking about it, she shuddered. The boundless suffering made her go back to the most miserable years in her previous life. At that time, there was a movement in her lower abdomen. The little bit of pure vitality condensed. Yes, it was the son she had lost in her previous life. "You finally forgave me and finally came back to find me." The joy of regaining what she had lost almost suppressed everything in an instant, and even the increasing pain was nothing. According to the secret method of controlling the reincarnation mirror in her memory, she forcibly broke the rules and took in a new soul from the outside world. Then, she stayed in the blood cocoon, watching the life in her lower abdomen grow slowly, and waited for the day when he would come with her full of expectation. However, she had forgotten that her situation was not one that a small, ordinary life could survive in. But 5 months old, the breath of life in her lower abdomen no longer increased, but because of the harsh environment of tactical matrix of reincarnation, it began to disappear slowly. No, it can't dissipate. At that moment, Su Li felt as if her heart was cut by a knife. The scene of losing her son in her previous life reappeared, adding another scar. She couldn't bear to lose her child again. "Since ordinary life can't survive, then I will let you become a rare dragon or phoenix." Without thinking for too long, Su Li made a crazy decision. Then, all the opportunities, including the life ring, tactical matrix of reincarnation, and bloody elixir, were transmitted to the unformed life in her lower abdomen through her body. But how could Qi Xianqing, an ancient existence with indifferent bloodline, empathize with the pain of loss? So, after a long silence, Su Li finally said lightly, "My life is in my own hands." Qi Xianqing opened his mouth and said nothing for a while. Chapter 315. Qi Xianqing and the old beggar left, but they didn't take Su Li's son away. It was probably because the movement was too big this time, and they couldn't guarantee that they would not be noticed by the mirror spirit. If the mirror spirit noticed Su Li's son in advance, it was not a good thing for them. Su Li took her son out of practice and didn't contact with others. She only asked Feng Yuan to come over and talk with him for a night. In everyone's ardent expectation, only Feng Yuan came out of the adytum. No, there was also the crying baby in his arms. In Shuedong was stunned and looked at the baby in surprise. She couldn't help asking, "Where is Su Li?" Although they didn't talk to Su Li, they all saw Su Li and Fong Yuan talking in the addendum. Why was he the only one who came out at night? Fong Yuan pursed his lips tightly. At this moment, compared with his usual indifference, he had a lot of unwillingness and sadness that couldn't be explained. However, no matter how much his heart was bleeding and how much he wanted to destroy the world, he didn't show it on his face. Facing Yin Shuedong's question, he shook his head blankly and said, "She has left. It's urgent. But before she left, she told me the next arrangement of the Linli building. Time is pressing. Let's go back first." Yin Shuedong and others didn't doubt him and immediately went back. At the same time, they were relieved. It seemed that Su Li's crisis had passed, and the Linli building didn't need to worry about being leaderless. "Fong Yuan, who is this child?" Chu Qingning couldn't help but ask. It was too strange that there was a child inexplicably. Fong Yuan looked down at the baby who was tired of crying. His eyes were full of love and hatred. He hated so much that he was crazy. This child was Ling Li's son, but he also loved him, because the blood flowing in his body was Su Li's. "Eldest brother?" Fong Mu reminded. Fong Yuan suddenly came to his sense. After a moment of silence, he said, "I will raise this child personally. He won't cause any trouble. You don't need to worry about him." Then, he left first regardless of everyone's reaction. "Tut-tut." Chu Qingning shook his head and said, "Falling flowers are longing for love, but the heartless stream is heartless. Fong Yuan, you are really depraved. Don't say that." Yin Shuedong complained. Seeing that Fong Yuan's figure had disappeared in the spiritual boundary, she could not help but sigh. It was not difficult to guess who the child's parents were, but if it was true, Fong Yuan's life was too bitter. In the northern snow country of the true spirit world, it was currently winter. The wasteland outside the city was covered in snow, and the world was quiet. The two soldiers guarding the city rubbed their hands and cursed, "This damn weather is freezing people to death. If I didn't have a Hotion 8th stage cultivation now, I would have been frozen to death." After the blood elixir was transmitted into her son's body, it was completely quiet. She spent several months to get back more than 1,000 points of foundation. She hurried with all her strength and spent more than 100 points. The foundation is more durable than before. Su Li calculated and found this. Maybe it was the effect of the tactical matrix of absolute sky, but at this point, she had no time to care about these details. Old ancestor of Shaoshan Palace, Su Li squinted her eyes and walked straight to the Shaoshan Palace. Although Jing Xian said that the old ancestor of Shaoshan Palace had temporarily given up contact with the Dongfang family and hid in the palace, but who could guarantee that after she left, the old ancestor of Shaoshan Palace would not come back and attack the Yinma cult? Both the old beggar and the master were weak. If the news was known by Shaoshan Palace, even if the Yinma cult and the Linli building were tied together, they couldn't compare to Shaoshan Palace. Thinking of this, Su Li's killing intent soared. Shaoshan Palace must die. Otherwise, she couldn't leave peacefully. "Who are you? How dare you break into my Shaoshan Palace? Tell me your purpose, or I won't forgive you." As soon as she passed through the illusion matrix, many elders in the Shaoshan Palace were immediately shocked. In the blink of an eye, several rainbows flew to her. Su Li glanced at them. 10 people at the peak of the inborn realm and 3 in the longevity realm. It deserved to be the first force in the spiritual circle. However, if all these people die, the old ancestor of Shaoshan Palace should come out. Su Li's face was cold. At the moment when many elders stopped, she pulled out the sword in her hand. Boom! An earth-shattering aura instantly enveloped the 13 people, causing this group of elders, who usually lived like princes, to turn pale with fright. No, she is a senior in the late stage of longevity realm. Retreat. Go to ask the Grand Elder. Only the senior in the supernatural realm can capture the demon girl at one stroke. The elders who had just stopped saw that the situation was not good and ran away quickly. But Su Li had the intention to kill them, so she wouldn't let them go. She increased her strength from 10% to 20%, and her body movement suddenly increased. She flashed in front of the elder who escaped the fastest, and indifferently raised the sword to cut down. You have no chance. Go to hell. Boom. A burning light like the sun burst out from the tip of the sword and quickly enlarged in front of the elder. No. The elder only let out a scream and was completely drowned by the sword light. Suli didn't stop and continued to kill the remaining elders. After the tactical matrix of Jution, her realm had far exceeded the level of the longevity realm. She couldn't estimate her specific strength. However, no matter whether they reached the supernatural realm or not, these elders who were only in the first and second realms of longevity realm had no strength to escape in front of her. Which Excellency Gu Zhou came to visit my palace. Please be merciful. In the middle of killing, a terrible pneuma finally rose in the forbidden area of the Shaoshan Palace. Suli stopped and stood in the nothingness, looking at it calmly. Since the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace had come out, she didn't need to waste her foundation anymore. However, in less than a breath, the space in front of Suli was distorted for a moment, and then an old man in a green robe stepped out. After seeing Suli, his triangular eyes immediately glowed, and a subtle look flashed from his eyes. At the same time, he didn't forget to say, "Why are these unpresentable juniors so angry?" After a moment, the old man in a green robe seemed to see something, and his eyes suddenly fixed. "Your Excellency, who are you? I know almost all the practitioners of the Guizhou province like the back of my hand. Why have I never seen you and your bone age?" A faint smile appeared on Suli's face, and she was extremely cold. "You ask me who I am? I am the one who will kill you." Boom! A wave that was 100 times stronger than before broke out without warning. In an instant, the surrounding palaces and pavilions were shaken into powder, and countless disciples of the Shaoshan Palace died. The old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace's face changed greatly. This momentum was no less than the supernatural realm. "Damn it! You dare to attack me. Aren't you afraid of being suppressed to death by the reincarnation mirror?" Under the premise of the agreement, the ancient existence didn't expect that Suli would attack him. Almost all of Suli's attacks hit him. But even so, after the vast wave passed, although the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace was covered with blood and some injuries, his limbs were still intact. He flashed back and wanted to keep a distance from Suli. Suli frowned slightly. She attacked with all her strength, but the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace was only slightly injured. The existence of the ancient level was really not so easy to kill. Sensing that there was still more than half of the foundation, Suli's eyes showed determination. Originally, she wanted to go back to have a look after finishing this thing. But now, burn! With a deafening shout between heaven and earth, the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace was horrified to see that Suli's body was ignited with a layer of white flame. He suddenly thought of something and immediately shouted in horror, "Burn the foundation? You are an outsider. You are actually..." Chapter 316. In the Shaoshan Palace, countless palaces collapsed, and the earth veins were broken, shaking thousands of miles. Even the small city of the snow country at the foot of the divine mountain could feel the shaking. Countless ordinary mortals and low-level warriors escaped from their houses and stood on the street, looking at the source of the earthquake with uncertainty. That direction is the Shaoshan Palace. Did something happen to the Shaoshan Palace? Impossible. The Shaoshan Palace is a powerful force. It is known as the first in the spiritual circle. How could it be attacked to its base camp? Whether it is or not, we will know after a while. The news will come out eventually. At this moment, above the divine mountain, the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace fled crazily, but there were still countless scars on his body. In the blink of an eye, he was seriously injured. Suli burned her foundation, and her combat power increased several times. At the beginning, the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace could resist with the trump card in his hand. But as time went by, the protective treasure in his hand exceeded the bearing limit. After it burst, the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace immediately smelled the breath of death. Regardless of the loss of the treasure, the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace suppressed his anger and persuaded her, "Fellow practitioner, what is the irreconcilable hatred between us? Why do you have to die with me regardless of your life? Tell me. Let's bury the hatchet. Why do we have to hurt each other? Su Li heard the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace, and then a more violent attack burst from the sword. Maybe not before, but after today, if I let you go, you will never let me go. She didn't know the details of the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace, but she knew his temperament from Tantai Feng Feng. He was narrow-minded, vengeful, and extremely protective. After Ling Li killed the Dongfang family, as long as the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace knew that there was no threat to him, he would not mind to destroy any weak existence related to him. Seeing that Su Li did not stop, but attacked more fiercely, the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace, who had always wanted to calm down, was completely desperate. Then the anger and viciousness in his heart broke out like a flood. Ignorant Junior, you are just like an ant. If you really want to die, I will help you. In the end, the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace's anger turned into an inhuman roar. The next moment, his skinny body immediately swelled like a balloon. His clothes burst in the blink of an eye, and he turned into a behemoth that was taller than the central hall of the Shaoshan Palace. Walala! Pieces of white scales appeared on the surface of the skin. Su Li looked dignified. She flew hundreds of meters away and finally saw the monster clearly. The old ancestor of the Shaoshan sect was a shifty-eyed pangolin monster. Heavens, what kind of monster is this? It even collapsed the central hall. Monster! Our old ancestor is actually a demon. No wonder there are human experts attacking us. Run. I actually cultivated in a demon's lair for 100 years. How terrifying. As soon as the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace showed his real body, the people of the Shaoshan Palace immediately became distracted. Many loyal disciples were at a loss and forgot to dodge. They were crushed into blood by the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace. After transforming into the original body, old ancestor of the Shaoshan realm could no longer maintain the calmness of the human tribe. His big eyes were bloodthirsty. He waved his forearms furiously. Many elders and disciples who had just escaped to the edge of the mountain-protecting tactical matrix were smashed into a cloud of blood mist before they could resist. All traitors must die. The old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace roared and started to kill. Although his body was huge, his speed did not decrease, but became faster. In the blink of an eye, there were only a few living creatures left on the holy mountain of the Shaoshan Palace. Very few escaped. Su Li stood in the air behind the crazy pangolin. Her face was paler than before. Her wrists were faintly transparent, and light could be penetrated from them. The destruction of the Shaoshan Palace could be said to be caused by her, but she did not feel guilty at all. Time was approaching. In order to fulfill her wish, she had already become a devil without bottom line and principles as in the previous life. Less than 300 foundation. Su Li murmured. The feeling of dying had never been so clear. Maybe as long as she waved her sword 3 times with all her strength, she would die completely. However, after the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace returned to the original body, his defense power was greatly increased. 3 swords couldn't even break his scales. If the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace hadn't become less intelligent and hadn't noticed her, she might have been seriously injured now. The strength of the ancient existence. Su Li frowned and clenched the hilt of the sword. She still took it for granted. Her memory told her that her foundation in the Jiuzhou region was no more than 1,000 years. Even if she could gather all the foundation in an instant, she might not be the opponent of the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace. Not to mention the less than 1,000 foundation in this way, she might not be able to eliminate the threat for him. Su Li's face showed a touch of regret. Then suddenly, she was stunned and looked up. There was a sense of familiarity from the soul. At the same time, the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace, who was still raging on the holy mountain, let out a roar in a panic. Then he clawed the ground crazily. In the blink of an eye, half of his body was submerged in the ground. He wants to escape. Su Li's eyes suddenly brightened. She did not hesitate to raise the sword in her hand. She rushed out and slashed at the ground. This slash evaporated 200 foundation, but the result was obvious. An unprecedented shock passed into the ground, and a big hole appeared in the ground, which just made the head of the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace reappear. Roar! A roar of fear far greater than anger came from his mouth. Then, before he continued to sink into the ground, everything suddenly became quiet. To be precise, everything was still, except Suli, who was still gasping. Suli looked down at her almost invisible hands, and then looked up at the clouds in the sky. There, a face appeared. It was not a human face, or the face of any creature in the world. At least in Suli's memory, there was no such creature. But she felt that this face was extraordinarily harmonious, as if it was the most perfect combination between heaven and earth. The inferior demon imprisoned the Shaoshan Palace, showed its original body, and disturbed the reincarnation mirror realm. You should die. Suli's pupil shrank suddenly. As the cold mechanical voice resounded in her ears, the Shaoshan Palace, who was still desperately fleeing, directly dissipated. Like a fragile sand sculpture, it drifted away with the wind after being air-dried. Except for a little ash, there was no trace left. Witnessing this scene, even Suli, who was fearless, couldn't help but feel a throb in her heart. What kind of means was this? The power of words? Even in the Jiuzhou region, there was absolutely no such a terrifying existence that she had heard. What on earth was the reincarnation mirror? Suli was silent and calmed down. She would never know the answer. It's you? Suddenly, a slightly surprised voice sounded in her ears, which was a little more lively than the mechanical voice just now. Then, before Suli could respond, a transmission wave suddenly swept over, and the face in the sky disappeared without a trace. After a while, some warriors finally dared to come to the Shaoshan Palace to find out what happened. When they saw the doomsday scene of blood and broken walls on the holy mountain, they were so scared that they couldn't even speak. Since then, the news of the destruction of the Shaoshan Palace spread throughout the real spiritual circle at a very fast speed, as if it had wings. Everyone was guessing what kind of existence could destroy the number one power in the real spiritual circle in one day. Thinking of the horror behind it, the whole spiritual circle fell into panic. In the reopened Linli building, Fang Yuan stared at the intelligence file from the Wanjian sect on the table. He was silent for a long time. When the baby cried in the inner room, he got up and walked into the inner room. After coaxing the child to sleep again, Fang Yuan looked at the dark night outside the window and was silent for a moment. Suddenly, he closed the window and then nailed it. He turned over his palm, and a small wooden memorial tablet appeared in his hand. Then he put it in the gap of the nailed windowsill and covered it with curtains. No one could see the clue. After doing all this, Fang Yuan returned to the bed and sat down cross-legged. Su, Li, if there is a next life, can I wait for you? There was a low murmur in the room, with unspeakable sadness and softness. No one could imagine that he, who had always been decisive and cold, would have such a voice. At this moment, in a golden palace with no end, Suli stood in the middle of the hall and looked at the existence in front of her, whose claws were thousands of times higher than her. Was this the mirror spirit of reincarnation mirror? Suli took a deep breath. Facing this existence, she felt small as facing the sea. The pangolin demon, which was hundreds of meters high, was only the size of a claw in front of it. There was such a huge monster in the world. If it was in the outside world, even the space of one region could not accommodate it. When Suli was amazed by the mirror spirit, the ancient existence also opened its eyes and looked at Suli. After a while, a voice like a big bell reverberated from the huge palace. I remember that you are the human who woke me up hundreds of years ago. Suli was slightly stunned. In her memory, she was the holy girl in that sect. It was indeed her who touched reincarnation mirror and made a vision appear. I see. There is a breath of the master in your soul. Maybe you are the descendant left by the master. But this breath is too weak, and you are about to dissipate, so it is useless. The master of reincarnation mirror? Suli had doubts in her heart, but she didn't ask. There were only dozens of points of foundation left in her body, and the speed of dissipation was accelerating. In a few minutes, she would die. so it was useless to ask so much. Originally, I was still optimistic about you, and even let you control a part of reincarnation mirror to do things for me after you passed the 9 reincarnations. But now, the voice of the mirror spirit suddenly became indifferent. For a nominal cultivation companion, you chose to die. So, I misjudged you. Since you chose to die, don't be too reluctant to leave the world. Let's go. Chapter 317. The Breath of a Chess Piece. After Suli disappeared, the indifferent look of the mirror spirit gradually showed a touch of coldness. Is it a conspiracy against me that she touched me? It was one of the most ancient existences in the world and could sense the past and the future. Since Suli entered the reincarnation mirror, it fell into a deep sleep again. This time it woke up, on the one hand, because of Shaoshan, and on the other hand, it sensed the threat from Suli. What kind of existence could pose a threat to it? Certainly, it couldn't be Suli herself. The answer must be that someone behind Suli was manipulating her to deal with her. Therefore, after it sensed carefully and couldn't trace the source, it made a prompt decision to end Suli's life. In this way, the crisis in the dark dissipated in advance. With the disappearance of Suli, the mirror spirit sensed for a while and confirmed that the hidden crisis had receded. Then it slowly closed its eyes and fell asleep. Because of the war in ancient times, its injury was too serious. If there were no other healing treasures, it could only rely on a long sleep to recover. The sun rose and the moon set. In a twinkling of an eye, another half a year passed in the world of the illusion of reincarnation. In this half a year, the situation in the secular world had been completely different. In the imperial palace of Dahan country, it was cold and silent, like the peace after the storm. The bright sunshine shone through the wooden door of the hall, bringing a trace of warmth to the cool hall. Lingli, who stood in front of the golden throne, looked as cold as winter. His face was like a deep cold pool, with no end in sight. Dongfang Wuxue shrank his neck and withdrew his gaze. There was a trace of fear on his face, although he just sent his father to hell by himself. Not for anything else, it turned out that his mother had already been killed by this traitor. No wonder that he could no longer receive any news about his mother in the past 2 years. It was not that his mother didn't love him, but the only person who cared about him in the world had disappeared. Thinking of this, a touch of coldness appeared on his immature face. He looked at the civil and military officials kneeling below the hall with hatred. His mother's death must have something to do with these people. Among the officials, the most shocked one was Mrs. Gu. She stared blankly at her grandson, who stood tall and straight in front of the golden throne, like a dragon among men. Was this really her third grandson? When she received the news last night, she thought it would be a game with Dongfang Xiao as usual. But she didn't expect that when she entered the hall, she saw all the officials kneeling on the ground and shouting at Dongfang Xiao, who was horrified. "Your Majesty, please abdicate your throne. Your Majesty, please abdicate your throne. Your Majesty, please abdicate your throne." The third grandson, who had always been ignorant and foppish, stood in front of Dongfang Xiao like a magic sword. He looked down and was full of killing intent. "Dongfang Xiao, you are the emperor of a country, but you are jealous of the talented and perverse. You assassinated 3 generations of my Ling family. My grandfather, father, and brother all died in your hands. With such a big heart, how could you be the ruler of a country?" Dongfang Wuxue. Yes, Dongfang Wuxue, who had always been harmless in front of many princes, was like a cub at this moment, showing his sharp claws and teeth. "Although you are my father, you killed my mother. You deserve to die." After saying that, he raised the sword in his hand and fiercely chopped at Dongfang Xiao, whose cultivation had been sealed. A big head rolled from the chair to Mada, who was trembling all over. Dongfang Wushue's face was still full of disbelief. He would never expect that he was killed by his own son. At the same time, he was deeply confused. Why didn't the big backer of the Dongfang family send any message when they were in crisis? In the palace, many officials held their breaths for fear of disturbing the voice that was facing away from them. until Mrs. Gu couldn't help but step forward excitedly and murmured, Ling Li's body shook slightly. He came to his sense from the daze and restrained his emotions. He turned around and walked down the golden high platform. In the more frightened atmosphere of the officials, he helped Mrs. Gu to sit down slowly. He forced a smile on his face. Grandma, in addition to Dongfang Xiao, other people of the Dongfang family who participated in the attack have been killed. After I deal with the chores, I will go back with you and offer Dongfang Xiao's head to my grandfather. Great. Mrs. Gu was so excited that she couldn't control herself. She blushed and said, My good grandson, I didn't expect that you have been hiding for so many years. We were all kept in the dark by you. Ling Li only bowed his head and said, I'm sorry to make you scared. Please forgive me, Grandma. Forgive me? What did I do? Mrs. Gu stared at Ling Li with her old eyes. The more she looked at him, the prouder she became. She raised her head and said in a sonorous voice, If you didn't endure humiliation, how could you destroy the old enemy of the Ling family? If we really knew your details in advance, it was not difficult to disguise for a while. But after a long time, the old fox Dongfang Xiao would definitely see the clues. Speaking of this, Mrs. Gu glanced at the head under Mada's feet. She looked very happy. When she looked back to Ling Li's face, her pride and relief finally turned into heartache. The disguise for more than 10 years is not a joke. I hate you for not living up to expectations these years. You suffered at home, but you could bear it and develop your powers secretly. How hard was it? It's me who should say sorry. Looking at the old man crying in front of him, Ling Li was silent, and a sense of relaxation rose in his heart, as if the pain and tiredness of the past 10 years were nothing, but at the same time, he was more relieved. The resentment was finally over. Next, he could go to find Su Li, brotherly. It's great. I didn't expect that you were so promising. Kneeling behind Prime Minister Tang, suddenly stood up and walked to Ling Li. He danced and said, I didn't expect that you were so powerful. I don't like Dongfang Xiao for a long time. Prime Minister Tang was a little frightened and wanted to stand up to pull back the sugar. But he saw Ling Li smiled and patted Tang Lei's shoulder. You are also good. I am much worse than you. Tang Lei laughed. Prime Minister Tang was relieved and shook his head and sighed. Could it be that this was fortune favors fools? After cooperating with the Enma cult, he naturally saw the true face of Childly. But in order not to frighten his grandson, he didn't reveal it to Tang Lei. After a while, an imperial edict was taken out. The successor of the emperor was Dongfang Wuxue. The Dahan country was still the Dahan country and didn't suffer the fate of changing its name. But everyone knew that the country was no longer the surname of Dongfang. After a while, in the Ling mansion, Ling Ping and Xiaoming, who didn't go to the imperial court, stared at the young man who walked slowly with the help of Mrs. Gu. For a moment, they didn't know whether they were in reality or in a dream. Li, your leg. At this moment, Xiaoming couldn't see anything except the tall and straight young man who was much taller than her. For the first time, she looked up at her son. She couldn't control the crystal tears anymore. She threw herself into Ling Li's arms. Mom, Ling Li sighed softly and didn't say anything. Everything was in silence. Good boy. Ling Ping seemed to know his third brother for the first time. With a flash of inspiration in his mind, Ling Li, who stood up, immediately associated with the image in his mind. He laughed and said, I've always found it strange. The person who appeared many times and secretly saved me from danger, although his figure was very similar, was completely different from the one I saw before. So it was you. Ling Li smiled slightly and said in a low voice, Dongfang Xiao took away my father and eldest brother in that way. After I mastered some power, although I can't confront with him, I won't let him get what he wanted again. When Ling Ping heard it, his heart suddenly sank. Then he thought of something and his expression changed greatly. Grandma went to the imperial court today. You. Before he finished his words, Mrs. Gu suddenly threw a package into his arms and said, Ping, look at this. Then, as Ling Li said, Dongfang Xiao's head was used as a sacrifice to the deceased relatives of the Ling family. Everything went smoothly, but Xiaoming always felt that Ling Li was not happy. Instead, His thoughts became more and more complicated. Is it because of her? A beautiful face of a woman appeared in Xiaoming's mind. She couldn't help but be lost in thought. More than a year had passed unconsciously, but Li still didn't forget her. Since Li had been pretending to be a playboy before, how could he choose a man by his appearance? Was he really in love with Suli? Suli, where did she go? Thinking of this, Xiaoming sighed deeply. Lord Rue was also crazy to find her, but there was no news in the past 1.5 years. It seemed that she had disappeared from the world. Mom, when she was thinking, Ling Li's voice suddenly came. She looked up and saw Ling Li standing at the door calmly with a little impatience. Li, come in and talk. As usual, Ling Li walked into the room and closed the door. This made Xiaoming slightly absent-minded. She vaguely remembered that the last time Ling Li did this was also for Suli. He just wanted to ask how to please a girl. This time, there was no exception. Mother, keep this talisman. Ling Li didn't say much and gave a black diamond-shaped token to Xiaoming. In her puzzled eyes, he said, this is a protective token. It can resist any form of attack below the longevity realm. At the same time, it is also a token for giving orders. With it, you can also mobilize part of the power of the Enma cult. Enma cult? Xiaoming's pupil shrank suddenly. Even a woman like her who had never really stepped into the cultivation world, she still felt frightened when she heard the 3 words of the Enma cult. The supreme cult lurking in the Dahan country. You can even mobilize the power of the Enma cult? Speaking of this, Xiaoming suddenly thought of something and trembled. Hierarch of the Enma cult is called Childly, is it? Chapter 318. Hearing Ling Mo's words, Xiaoming was stunned. If it was in the past, she would never believe this kind of words. She would even reprimand Ling Li for boasting and causing trouble. But when she remembered that he came back with the head of Dongfang Shao, destroyed the powerful Dongfang family, and secretly protected the Ling family for several years, she had to believe such extraordinary means. Ling Li, her son, was the hierarch of the Enma cult, the supreme cult. Looking at the sparkling light in his mother's eyes, Ling Li knew that she had believed it. After a moment of silence, he continued, Mother, Ling Qinglan will deal with the affairs of the royal family of the Dahan dynasty. Are you going to find Suli? Xiaoming suddenly interrupted him, and her expression became soft. Hearing Xiaoming's words, Ling Li was slightly stunned. Xiaoming shook her head and sighed. You were born in my womb for 10 months. Even if you try to restrain yourself in the past year, I can still see that you can't forget her. Ling Li was slightly shocked. Then he took a deep breath and bowed to Xiaoming. I don't believe that Li will leave me for no reason. If I don't figure it out, even if I die, I won't die in peace. Therefore, I will have to trouble you and second brother to continue working hard for this family. Before Ling Li finished his words, Xiaoming had already blocked his mouth in a panic and blamed, You are such an unlucky child. I am still young. Besides, the biggest obstacle has been eliminated by you. You are the biggest project of the family. It's nothing for me to solve some trifles for you. Go to find her with peace of mind. Speaking of this, Xiaoming smiled softly. I am still waiting for my grandson. Thank you, Mother. Ling Li looked more relaxed. I will come back to see you within 3 years. Please don't worry about me. I will set off now. Then he bowed deeply again, and then turned out of the door without hesitation. He rode the spirit horse that had been prepared and went away. He didn't want to wait for a moment. Xiaoming, who followed him all the way to the gate, watched her son go away. The tenderness on her face immediately turned into bitterness. She turned back to the room and sat in silence for a moment. Then she sat in front of the dressing table and opened the top drawer of the small cabinet. She took out rolls of portraits one after another. These are the best girls in the capital city. Except for their different looks, they are not as good as Suli Ling Li. Why do you have to be so stubborn? Xiaoming sighed with tears in her eyes. She was selfish after all. After Suli disappeared for 3 months, she found no trace of her. Then, she secretly chose a new wife for Ling Li. However, on the one hand, Ling Li's reputation was so bad that no girls wanted to marry him. On the other hand, She saw the persistence in her son's eyes, so she didn't dare to show it. Lingli had always been a man of his word. If she really forced him to marry again, it would almost have the opposite effect. When she was hesitating, Ling Li's hidden identity came to the surface, which shocked the world. He became the object of love for countless girls. But she had seen Ling Li's determination today. These portraits, thinking of this, she threw all the portraits into the brazier. Suddenly, there was a big fire in the brazier, which made the light and shadow on Qiu Ming's face flicker. Ling Li got rid of the burden of the Ling family. He went out of the mansion and rushed for 7 days and 7 nights without eating or drinking. Finally, he arrived at the Qinghe province. He had monitored the mansions of the Su family and the Dongfang Rui family for more than a year, but he got nothing. The Linli building in Yunjing City had been closed half a year ago. Now, the only clue he could find was the Linli building in the Qinghe province. 1.5 years ago, after Mr. Li appeared to save him, Su Li disappeared almost at the same time. Moreover, the Linli building in Yunjing City also closed a few days later. It couldn't be a coincidence that the time was so tight. When dealing with the Dongfang family, he went to the Linli building to see Mr. Li more than once. But he was refused by the reason that Mr. Li traveled around. He even didn't see any protector of the Linli building. So, he was more suspicious and had the idea of exploring the Linli building in the Qinghe province. Good osmanthus wine. Come in and have a taste. The Liehua liquor is the real product of the northern country. It's a pity not to drink it. Ling Li, who had disguised himself, just entered the Linli building. His ears were filled with shouts. He glanced around and found that nearly 80% of the people in the lobby on the first floor were seated. Most of them were people in the martial arts circle. In the Qinghe province, the Linli building had replaced the Tainyake attic and became the favorite gathering place of people in the martial arts circle. Ling Li found a table and sat down. After a while, the waiter came to him. After ordering a pot of osmanthus wine, he looked around casually. He saw many ordinary drinkers and warriors drinking together. It was quite strange and harmonious. However, when he saw the wooden sign hanging not far from the entrance of the lobby, which said those who disturb will be killed without mercy, he suddenly understood. With the ability of the Linli building, the Yinma cult couldn't be the king of the secular world, not to mention frightening the rascals. As for Mr. Li, although he had been in contact with him for several years, he still couldn't figure out what he was thinking and what was the meaning of everything he did. Sir, here is your osmanthus wine. Please enjoy it slowly. The waiter brought a clear and transparent golden pot and left. Ling Li glanced at him and didn't ask much. He also knew the operating mode of the Linli building. These waiters were trained by the Linli building itself instead of being hired casually. If he rashly inquired, it would only alert the enemy. The familiar taste rolled into his throat. Ling Li's eyes darkened and his psychic awareness spread quietly. Although it was only a short period of more than a year, with the help of the elixir of Mr. Li, his cultivation had been improving at an extremely terrifying speed. Now he had reached the 5th hurdle of the longevity life. His cultivation was not inferior to that of the snake demon at that time. Therefore, under the cover of such a high realm of psychic awareness, no one in the entire Linli building noticed it. Even Feng Mu, who was stationed here, didn't find anything. No. Ling Li frowned when the psychic awareness came back to him. Although the attic on the top floor of the Linli building was clean, it was very deserted. No one had lived there for many years. Could it be that those people of the Linli building didn't lie to him? Did Mr. Li really travel around? Or did Mr. Li have another place? After drinking a cup of wine, Ling Li suppressed the irritation in his heart. If he couldn't find Mr. Li, he couldn't find Su Li. This was a dead knot. The young man in white at the peak of the inborn realm on the 3rd floor is probably a protector. Thinking of this, Ling Li threw a piece of silver and turned away. After nightfall, Feng Mu finished his practice for a day. He shook his head and helplessly left the Linli building. The nimbus in the city is heterogeneous. It's not good for my practice to stay here. Fortunately, I only need to stay 1 day a month. I don't know when I can break through the longevity life. If I can succeed, I don't have to continue to breathe the dirty air. Fong Mu sighed secretly. After Fong Yuan took charge of the Linli building, he set many rules. Even Fong Yuan had to strictly abide by them. Otherwise, he would be punished. His behavior immediately made Linli, who was in the dark, give up the idea of capturing him and interrogating him. Then he quietly followed Fong Yuan like a ghost. Following Fong Mu out of the city, Linli was more and more shocked. At last, he saw Fong Mu enter the valley that he missed so much. He was stunned. Here, was Su Li's yard in the valley? Could it be that Su Li was here? Yes, there were only a few places where Su Li was used to hiding. How could he forget this place? This was the place where he and Su Li spent several months. Linli couldn't help breathing heavily. But just after he took a step, two rainbow lights suddenly flashed in front of him. The cold killing intent in the rainbow lights made him slightly shocked. He immediately raised his sword to block. Clang! How amazing was the fight between two people in the longevity realm. The loud sound of the collision of weapons immediately shocked everyone in the valley. Chapter 319. Although the face of the young man in front of him had changed, Linli recognized his identity at a glance. He was Fong Yuan, whom he had taught in the valley that year. However, what surprised him was that Fong Yuan, who was only at the peak of the acquired realm at that time, had the cultivation of the third hurdle of the longevity realm in just 3 or 4 years. If he hadn't got the help of Mr. Li, he might have fallen behind Fong Yuan in cultivation. Linli was still shocked and doubtful. Fong Yuan slightly turned his face and looked at Yu Wuhai. He raised his eyebrows like a sharp sword. Yu Wuhai immediately bowed his head. He knew where he was wrong and didn't argue. "You, come with me." Ignoring Yu Wuhai, Fong Yuan coldly glanced at Ling Li's slightly shocked look. He suppressed the waves in his heart and said in a calm tone. Before Ling Li answered, he turned around and walked into the valley. Ling Li felt a little strange, but he kept walking. He would not let go of any clue about Su Li, even if it was a dangerous place in front of him. On the way, Ling Li, who looked dignified, suddenly heard a surprised voice, its eldest brother Ling. He followed the voice and saw a black-faced young man. He was He in those days. Now he also had the cultivation of the inborn realm. The others were also in the middle and late stages of the inborn realm. When did the cultivation of the people who followed Su Li become so? Ling Li was shocked. But now the valley was obviously controlled by Fong Yuan. If Fong Yuan didn't speak, he couldn't ask other things. He could only follow Fong Yuan silently and stopped in front of a building. This is, looking at the old but spotless bamboo building in front of him, Ling Li suddenly froze and thought back to 4 years ago. It was here that Li tried her best to kill the 2 elders of the blood refining hall. Then she took him to settle down. It took several months and hundreds of thousands of taels of silver to cure his poison. It was a pity that he couldn't recognize his heart at that time. He didn't know that he hurt her with the name of Ling Shui. Li is here? Ling Li's throat seemed to be blocked by something. After a long time, he spat out a sentence and didn't take a step forward. Fong Yuan was silent for a moment and finally said, "If you think so, it's right." "Really?" Ling Li was shocked and immediately couldn't control his temper. He stepped up to the bamboo building and walked to the bamboo door. His hands were slightly trembling as he pushed the door open. Fong Yuan stood downstairs and looked at him sarcastically. There was no hatred in his eyes. At this moment, there was more pity. No matter what happened in the past, at least now, he and I are both pitiful people. Creak. The bamboo door finally opened with a soft sound, as if welcoming a guest who had not been here for a long time. The smell of sandalwood wafted in the room. After opening the door, the scene inside was reflected in her eyes. Ling Li's body shook violently in an instant, and his eyes were full of disbelief. It was a memorial tablet. The 2 clear and vermilion words, Su Li, on it hurt his eyes. The suffocating pain spread rapidly, and then, a burst of anger mixed with confusion broke out instantly. "I don't believe it. Even if you don't believe it, it won't change the truth." It was unknown when Fong Yuan came to the bamboo house. He lit a stick of incense for the memorial tablet. He looked focused and affectionate. Li, I gave him a chance. He really didn't light the incense for you. With such an idea in mind, Fang Yuan seemed to be able to talk with Su Li. There was a trace of nostalgia and warmth between his eyebrows. After inserting the incense, Fang Yuan swept away the excess ash and turned around. He was not surprised to see Ling Li, who was lost. Half a year ago, he was also like this. If he hadn't had an unfinished wish, he would have left with Su Li without any hesitation at the moment when she disappeared. Ling Li. A voice with the spiritual shock of the longevity realm came into Ling Li's ears, which immediately made Ling Li's pupils condense a little. Sensing that Ling Li's attention returned to himself, Fang Yuan smiled coldly. Don't be so useless. I let you come to worship Li, not just to see you make a fool of yourself. Before Li left, she left several wishes. Now I can't fulfill them, so I can only entrust some of them to you. Hearing this, Ling Li immediately sobered up. He stared at Fang Yuan with burning eyes. After a moment, he said hoarsely, Are you willing? He could see that Fang Yuan was also deeply in love with Su Li. If he put himself in Su Li's shoes, he was absolutely unwilling to let anyone touch the things behind Su Li. Hearing Ling Li's words, Fang Yuan suddenly smiled like a winner. I love her. You are not as good as me. Ling Li's blue veins bulged. What did you say? Do I have to say it again? You are really a bitch, Ling Li. Before Fang Yuan finished his words, Ling Li responded to him with a big fist. Ling Li's eyes were full of coldness. Obviously, he was extremely angry. Bang! This punch fiercely hit Fang Yuan's side face in Ling Li's stunned eyes. Immediately, before he responded, Fang Yuan's fist also arrived. His right face was also not spared. Bang! 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 The continuous confrontation between the two men was very tacit. Neither of them used Xinqi. They were like street thugs, punching and kicking each other, rolling on the ground like a gourd. Their faces were covered in dirt, and they were in a sorry state. Chu Qingning heard the news and saw this scene as soon as he arrived. Suddenly, his mouth twitched slightly. Fang Mu, who was curious and wanted to go in to have a look, slipped away without looking back. Later, Luo Yichen, who had become the son-in-law of the Mei family, also rushed here and left the valley at the same speed. After Su Li disappeared, Fang Yuan's temper became extremely strange. He wanted to go back to accompany Mei Ruhan, but he didn't want to be unlucky. Both Ling Li and Fang Yuan were in the longevity realm. They had endless strength in their lives. Even if they didn't use Xiangong, they wouldn't feel very tired. They didn't know how long they fought. They only knew that the sky changed from day to night. After several rounds, Ling Li, whose original face could not be seen, struggled to pull out his clamped hands. He kicked on Fang Yuan's face, and they immediately separated. Fang Yuan wanted to get up with a straight face, but he couldn't mobilize any muscle in his body. Finally, he loosened his breath and lay on his back, unable to get up again. Seeing this scene, Ling Li showed an ugly smile on his face and also fell down. He gasped violently, but he didn't forget to show the glory of being the winner. I won. You are not as good as me. Fang Yuan's closed eyes suddenly opened and was full of unwillingness. He also gasped and said, If Su Li didn't give you the elixir, I would never. What elixir? Ling Li asked subconsciously. Suddenly, he was shocked and sat up directly. Regardless of the soreness of his body, he said in a hoarse voice, Elixir? The elixir that can help me enter the longevity realm? Fang Yuan knew that he spilled the beans, so he didn't say anything immediately. If he really told her, he would violate her last wish and let her down. But Ling Li was also a strategist since he was a child, and his mind was like a demon. All kinds of unbearable state of mind before were just because of the influence of Su Li. Now, after a round of fighting, his mind was clear. Many things came to his mind, and he suddenly thought of all kinds of possibilities that he hadn't thought of before. You said that the elixir was given to me by Su Li? But the elixir was given to me by Mr. Li. Ling Li didn't know where the strength came from. He suddenly stood up and waved his hand to blow a fine gust of wind, which removed all the mud and water on his body. Immediately, he waved his hand and a jade bone mask appeared in his hand. He glanced at Feng Yuan, who still closed his eyes, and said in a deep voice, "This thing is a set with the one I gave to Suli in the past. If the other side becomes an ownerless thing, as long as the range is not more than 100,000 miles, I will feel it. But now, I don't feel anything. How do you explain?" Feng Yuan opened his eyes and stared at the strange jade bone mask. He was not surprised at all, and still said nothing. Ling Li took a deep breath and forced himself to suppress the increasingly uneasy conjecture in his mind. He continued to ask, "Now I just want to ask one question. How did Suli die? Have you ever avenged her after such a long time?" "Avenged?" Feng Yuan subconsciously tightened his lips. Although the change of his expression was not obvious, it was keenly captured by Ling Li. "You haven't avenged her yet." Ling Li's eyes gradually became cold. Who was the enemy? Feng Yuan felt that he had recovered a little strength. He stood up and slowly cleaned the mud on his body. It could be seen that he was hesitating. He was struggling in his heart and didn't know what he was worried about. Ling Li was very patient and didn't urge him. He silently stood aside and waited for Feng Yuan to speak. But the pair of eyes like lightning still brought a lot of pressure to Feng Yuan. After a long time, Feng Yuan felt that there was no mud on his body to be cleaned. He suddenly came to his sense and looked up to see Ling Li still staring at him. His movement was stiff. It seemed that he finally figured it out and turned to walk to the east courtyard. "Follow me and you will know." Hearing this, Ling Li suddenly became spirited and followed him. As they passed through the gate of the courtyard, Ling Li suddenly saw a lot of toys made of wood. The surface was very smooth. It was obvious that they had been carefully polished. He couldn't help but wonder if Feng Yuan wanted to take him to see a child. But what did a child have to do with Suli? "Here we are." When Ling Li was thinking, they walked to the door and Feng Yuan suddenly said. He looked up subconsciously and suddenly saw a baby who looked less than 1 year old was playing with wooden toys accompanied by a wet nurse in a small space surrounded by wooden fences. This child, Ling Li was shocked when he saw the baby. A feeling of blood connection surged from the bottom of his heart. His son? How could it be his son? He and Suli obviously didn't. Wait. Ling Li suddenly thought of something. He stood in the same place in a daze, and he was stunned. Feng Yuan's eyes were slightly dim. As expected, as long as Ling Li saw it, he could recognize it at a glance. He loved Suli as much as Ling Li, but his luck was much worse than Ling Li's. But at this moment, the baby sensed something. He turned his head and saw 2 big men standing at the door. He immediately smiled and showed 2 small front teeth that had just grown out. Chapter 320. Mother? Ling Li's trembling face suddenly stopped. He looked back instantly, but there was no woman or even a person behind him. Who was the little guy calling? The wet nurse, who was taking care of him, changed her face slightly. She came over and saluted. She said in a panic, "Protector, please forgive me. I have tried my best to teach him, but he is 10 months old now, and he can only call mother." Ordinary babies could speak a lot when they were at this age. Some smart ones could even call father and mother when they were 7 months old. She had taken care of a lot of babies over the years, but she had never seen such a stupid one. Except for mother, he could not say anything. "I see. You can leave now." Feng Yuan waved his hand. For such a situation, he was already used to it. After the wet nurse left, Feng Yuan stepped into the room and picked up the child skillfully. Ling Li followed him. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Finally, he loosened his body. He didn't know why he gave up the idea of asking to hold the child. Seeing this, Feng Yuan's expression remained unchanged. He lowered his head and looked at the restless little fellow in his arms. His cold eyes seemed to overflow with tenderness at the moment. He said, "I named him Nian." "Nian," Ling Li said to himself. It was self-evident who Nian was. Li told me not to tell you anything. Fang Yuan's tone was very light. It seemed that he was afraid to disturb the little guy. But the unwillingness in his words was enough to shock Ling Li. But I am not reconciled. Why? She was born with a hard life. Not only did she not think for herself in this life, but she also did so much for you silently. But you didn't know anything about it and accepted it heartlessly. You even resented her because of her disappearance. Ling Li held his breath. He shook his head and murmured, "Resented? How could I resent her? He just missed her so much that he sped up the destruction of the Dongfang family." After abandoning the heavy burden, he did not hesitate to set foot on the road to find Su Li. But compared with what he had done for Su Li in these years, these words were too weak. Fang Yuan snorted and sneered, "Don't think I don't know what you are thinking. Do you think it is so easy to destroy the Dongfang family? If Su Li didn't make a move in advance, you would have been destroyed by the Shaoshan Palace behind the Dongfang family." Shaoshan Palace? Ling Li was frightened and couldn't help raising his voice. The Shaoshan Palace in the spiritual circle? A year ago, the Shaoshan Palace was suddenly destroyed by a mysterious force. All kinds of rumors were flying. There were also many rumors in the Yinma cult. At that time, he guessed that it was probably the Ghost Valley who did it. But now, according to Fang Yuan, it was actually the spiritual realm? Ling Li's eyes flickered. Yes, only the mysterious force like the spiritual realm could destroy the Shaoshan Palace. Fang Yuan's face was colder. Who said it is the spiritual realm? Ling Li, today I will let you know how much you owe Su Li. Ling Li, I will tell you. Ling today. I will let you today. Su, Shaoshan Qing, said. Otherwise, I won't be able to sleep at night for the rest of my life. Ling slightly. Ling Ling, Ling. Ling Ling back. Ling was, too. But Ling and Ling, in. She, in. And Ling Li's pupils shrank slightly, but he nodded without hesitation. Brother Fang, speak frankly. Fang Yuan was silent for a moment, and his expression was slightly relaxed. He said, Su Li, you are right. With that, he glanced at the little fellow who was still sucking on his finger. Although I don't want to admit it, but he's your flesh and blood. Aren't you going to hug him and bring him back? Ling Li shook his head painfully and said bitterly, I am not qualified. I'll make plans after I hear what you have to say. Fang Yuan was stunned and said, All right. A moment later, in the quiet room of the valley's side courtyard, In Xuedong served tea to them and glanced at Ling Li, who looked haggard and lost in thought. She didn't say anything and turned away. The room was silent for a long time. Fang Yuan seemed to organize his words and finally said, There is one thing that you should know. Ling Xian, your maid, almost made Li die because of the fake news. Li's only aunt, Su Yu, also died because of this. One corpse and 2 lives. Ling Li gently covered his chest with his right hand and nodded silently. Fang Yuan's mentioning of the past was no less than tearing his scabbed wound again. Fang Yuan didn't sympathize with him and continued coldly, But you only complained that Su Li killed Ling Xian at that time, but you didn't care about Su Li. Her injury was also serious. The degree of seriousness was beyond your imagination. The elixirs you sent were useless. At that time, the doctor even asked us to prepare for her funeral. Ling Li's pupils suddenly shrank and he said in surprise, How could it be? Later, do you want to say that Su Li was still fine after that? Fang Yuan narrowed his eyes and said, Hierarch Ling, think about it carefully. Don't let me look down on you. Ling Li slightly pursed his lips and whispered. Li was a little abnormal. It seemed that she didn't dare to use Xingong easily. But I was busy with the affairs of the Yinma cult at that time. Later, Su Li returned to normal, so I didn't care about it. Now it seems, yes. Fang Yuan's eyes were burning. At that time, Su Li was like an hourglass. Hourglass? Ling Li's look changed. Fang Yuan immediately sneered and said, Yes, in order to live, in order to continue to fulfill your meaningless wishes, she embarked on a road of no return. She gambled everything in exchange for a short period of strength. In a few years, she controlled Nanjiang country and Tianji country successively, which were all to create a peaceful environment for you. But you provoked the ancient existence, so she had to kill it at the cost of her own life. After coming back, her old injury relapsed, and she had to arrange the tactical matrix to tide over the difficulties. Although she survived, her life came to an end. But there was only a little time left. She still wanted to pave the way for you. After arranging the funeral affairs, she went to the Shaoshan Palace alone and died together with the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace. Lingli, now do you know? How much do you owe Su Li? If it weren't for her, how could it be so easy for you to unify the martial arts circle? If it weren't for her, you would still be at the peak of the inborn realm and couldn't completely control the Yinma cult. If it weren't for her, you would have been killed by the old ancestor of the Shaoshan Palace, and your Ling family would not exist in the world. At this point, Fang Yuan's eyes were full of coldness. He said, "But these years, what did your Ling family do? Although I can't wait for your Ling family to divorce Su Li and let me guard Su Li's tomb justifiably. But your mother secretly collected the portraits of those ladies in the past year. I don't believe that you don't know. But what are you doing? You only have your revenge in your eyes. Until Su Li died, you never really did anything for Su Li. You don't deserve Su Li at all." Boom! The anger erupted from Fang Yuan's body like a volcano. The momentum was like a cold blade hitting Ling Li. Ling Li's body protection immediately collapsed without any strength. Clang! The long sword was unsheathed and placed on the neck of Ling Li, who was in a trance. Fang Yuan's eyes were full of killing intent. Although what he said was all speculation, but from the words of the old beggar and Qi Xianqing, he had already speculated about 80% or 90% of the truth. Even if there were some details that were missing, it was not surprising that they were not important. "You kill me." Ling Li suddenly calmed down. His turbulent mind recovered like a pool of stagnant water. At this moment, countless memories of getting along with Su Li in his mind were broken one after another. Finally, only the first time they met. In the bright lights, the two met. The girl cried bitterly. The boy was inexplicable and even vigilant. Since then, he had been in debt. Until now, he could no longer pay off the debt. It was better to pay with his life. Maybe he could see her again in the netherworld. That's enough. Everyone stop. Suddenly, an old voice came. Then a black shadow flashed. The short old beggar had appeared. His two old fingers, which were like bark, clamped the blade of Fang Yuan's sword. Ding! The tip of the sword was broken. "Senior?" Fang Yuan's pupil shrank slightly. He immediately stopped. At the same time, there was a trace of fear in his heart. Just now, he was in a rage and lost his reason. If the old beggar didn't stop him, he might really kill him. Taking back the sword, Fang Yuan felt a little sorry. Not to mention Su Li's order, he couldn't let Nian lose his parents just for Su Li. The old beggar looked at Ling Li, who was absent-minded and didn't care about his arrival. He sighed. "Wake up. Maybe everything will turn for the better." Although the voice was calm, it was like a pervasive drizzle into Ling Li's awareness sea, which was almost closed. He suddenly woke up, and the light in his eyes condensed quickly. "Turn for the better?" he said subconsciously, but found that his voice was extremely hoarse and unpleasant, like sand. This was the extreme grief caused by the state of mind. Even if he had a high cultivation, he couldn't avoid it. "Are you a fortune teller?" At this time, Ling Li recognized the old beggar. It was clearly the person who made a strange divination for him a few years ago. The old beggar smiled and looked at them. Both of them were one-in-a-million geniuses, and there were powerful figures behind them. Otherwise, they would never be arranged to be with the two mirror masters, and even have all kinds of entanglements with them. However, even those powerful figures would never expect that these two people didn't plant seeds in Su Li's heart. Looking at the current situation, they clearly became Su Li's furnace and let her do whatever she wanted. Of course, all this was based on the basis that Su Li was still alive. "What is the turning for the better that you mentioned?" Fang Yuan frowned, and there was a trace of urgency in his words Is it possible that Li didn't? I naturally don't know whether Miss Su is alive or not. But at the last moment when the Shaoshan Palace was destroyed, I sensed the breath of the mirror spirit. Maybe. Speaking of this, the old beggar stroked his beard and stopped talking. Ling Li and Fong Yuan's eyes immediately brightened. Since you come here, there must be a gap in your heart. If there is anything that we can help, please tell us. As long as we can save Li's life, we will die for it. Ling Li said loudly, and his eyes were full of determination. Chapter 321. I just thought of the method recently. The old beggar sat down and looked at Ling Li sideways. Do you remember the rune I drew for you in those years? Ling Li nodded, of course. When he drew the rune for him in those years, the old beggar talked like a child's play. But at this moment, the old man sitting in front of him inadvertently revealed his temperament, which proved that the rune was not drawn casually at that time. The old beggar smiled slightly when he heard this. Perhaps everything is destined by the heavens. A few years ago, I also drew a talisman for Miss Su in addition to you. Now that talisman has become the key to finding the opportunity. Then, the old beggar reached out his hand and touched Ling Li's wrist gently. Immediately, a large number of tadpole-like black runes emerged and covered the whole back of his hand in the blink of an eye. Ling Li's pupils shrank. The rune that the old beggar drew on his arm and wrist was spreading quietly these years, and he didn't notice it at all. Although there was a strange feeling of discomfort in his heart, Ling Li was anxious to know the way to save Su Li at this moment, so he just ignored it. He cupped his hands and said, "Senior, please teach me." The old beggar didn't seem to expect that Ling Li would be so straightforward. He looked slightly surprised, and then smiled more. "Let me tell you in detail. As long as you break this world according to what I said, Miss Su's soul can come back." A few hours later, the old beggar's figure suddenly disappeared, as ethereal as when he appeared. The door of the quiet room was opened. Ling Li and Fong Yuan walked out side by side and stood in front of the yard. The night had passed, and there was a touch of dawn in the sky, which was slightly dazzling. "Ling Li, do you believe what he said?" Fong Yuan suddenly spoke and broke the silence. He looked sideways, and his eyes were like a cold lake, flashing fiercely. Ling Li looked cold and breathed lightly, as if he was relieving the pressure. He said firmly in a deep voice, "You and I both know that no matter whether the old senior is selfish or not, as long as there is a glimmer of hope, I will not give up. This is the road I choose, and I will keep going until the end." Fong Yuan's eyes were shining, and he nodded gently after a moment. "Maybe it's a little late to say this. Su Li may have expected that I would not hide it from you. So, she left you 3 requirements." Ling Li's eyes moved slightly. "What is it?" Fong Yuan looked at him enviously and finally said, "First, forget her." Ling Li looked cold and was about to speak. Fong Yuan shook his head and said, "Listen to me first." Ling Li could only suspend his thoughts and continue to listen. As for her second request, if you meet someone you like in the future, marry them. Thirdly, take good care of Nian. Ling Li suddenly smiled, full of self-mockery. He said, "I can only promise the last one." As for the first 2, he clasped his hands behind his back and tilted his head to look at the dazzling morning light. His eyes darkened and became as deep as the night. How is this possible? Fong Yuan smiled slightly and didn't entangle too much on this issue. He had violated most of the instructions left by Su Li. If Ling Li didn't listen, he was not qualified to control it. If this could make Su Li come back, he would be willing to die. Nian is just a nickname. Consider it as a nickname given to him by me as his uncle. As his biological father, you should give him a proper name. That's called Buwang, Su Buwang. Does she want me to forget her? It's impossible in the next life. If you want to remember her in the next life, I won't have a chance. At that time, we can compete fairly. I don't believe that your luck will always be so good. Ha ha ha. Outside the wall of the yard, Chu Qingning craned his neck to look around. When he heard two magnetic laughter coming from the yard, he couldn't help but feel strange. These two people were stubborn. Yesterday, they were fighting with each other. How could they be like brothers after one night? He shook his head and turned to leave. Fang Yuan was in charge of the affairs of the Linli building. He was happy to be free. In Shuedong had been pregnant for more than 3 months. He had to go back to study the food for the girl. After a secret talk, Lingli left the yard without taking Su Buwang with him. Soon after, Fang Yuan, who had stayed in the yard for half a year, also set off for the spiritual circle. 3 days later, Fang Yuan, who was travel-worn, returned first with a tired face. He was not Su Li. It was very difficult to persuade Jing Xian, the great master of the spiritual realm. Anyway, after he said that the old beggar and Su Li were probably not dead, Jing Xian agreed even if the action might make them doomed eternally. Another 2 days later, Ling Li reappeared. He didn't say much. After seeing Fang Yuan, he nodded. Fang Yuan didn't go deep into what method Ling Li used to let the Yinma cult execute the seemingly self-destructive order. He waved his hand for He, and his eyes darkened. "Let's go." He Zi looked dignified. He bowed deeply and turned away. Since the two men who stood at the peak of power gave the order, the secular world, the martial arts circle, and the spiritual circle were all turbulent. Countless martial artists and spies were sent out and integrated into the whole world to look for the remaining people with life rings openly and secretly. Fang Yuan gently pricked the Naguan point, and a pale red life ring immediately lit up on his wrist. Others could see it, but couldn't touch it. Only he could really touch it and decide his own fate. As early as when Su Li left, she had already told him the meaning of this life ring. This world was fake. The life ring meant that he should have another identity outside this illusion. Dying in this world was not a real death. But if he broke the life ring by himself, everything would be over. A year ago, 8,000 people were deceived to break their life rings to sacrifice to the tactical matrix. That was to say, from that moment on, at least 8,000 people died in the outside world. The outside world had been in chaos as expected. But now, according to the old beggar's plan, they had to continue to collect life rings, and the number should not be less than 10,000. The turbulence could be imagined. Li's life ring is broken. Can she really be saved? Fang Yuan was deeply confused. He should believe in Li, but the old beggar gave him hope. So, even if he had many doubts in his heart, he still did not hesitate to carry out this extremely selfish and bloody plan. In less than 3 months, with the intervention of several dynasties and big forces, countless people who were detected to have life rings were sent to the secret boundary of the spiritual realm. All of these people were famous figures. They were either young geniuses whose names shook the world, or were extremely wealthy. Some were important figures of large clans, and some were not wealthy martial artists, but they were indeed good people with good reputations. With the inexplicable disappearance of these people, resentment and anger accumulated extremely fast. After the balance was broken, the entire illusion of reincarnation was in chaos in the blink of an eye. Flash floods, earthquakes, and natural disasters came one after another. In just a few months, there were countless deaths and injuries, and everyone was in danger. Some people were spreading the words of the end of the world, and people were in panic. At this moment, in the secret place of the spiritual realm, there was a dense crowd of people. It could be seen that all people's life rings had been broken, and the number was not 10,000 as the old beggar said, but 100,000. Each of them had a transparent silk thread connected to the complex big tactical matrix. The foundation flowing in the big tactical matrix was darker than the blood red of that year, like ink black. In the center of the big tactical matrix, Su Buwang crawled around. His eyes were pure and flawless, and he didn't know how evil he was. Good, good, good. The old beggar looked at such a spectacular scene, and his eyes were full of excitement. He shouted excitedly and looked at Lingli and Fang Yuan, who looked gloomy. He praised without concealment. I didn't expect that in just 2 months, you can collect so many life rings, 100,000. This is close to the total number of all the regions. If this tactical matrix fails, it will be unacceptable. Let me start the big tactical matrix. As he said, the old beggar took a step forward, but was stopped by Lingli. It's impossible for us to go back now. Senior, should you tell the truth? Is Nian in danger in the tactical matrix? This tactical matrix breaks the world. Can it really finally? The old beggar suddenly looked sullen and seemed to be angry. Ignorant boy. How can I lie to you? Time is pressing. Get out of my way. The mirror spirit must have noticed the clues at this moment. If we don't start the big tactical matrix immediately, it will be too late. Ling Li's pupils shrank. What mirror spirit? He didn't understand. At this moment, Fang Yuan pulled him aside and said in a deep voice, "Let's see. We have no way back." Ling Li's face was slightly sullen. "What are you hiding from me?" Fang Yuan nodded silently and whispered, "After this, I will tell you everything. What the old beggar said is true. But what will happen after this world is broken? I don't know." While they were talking, the old beggar had come to Su Bu Wang and took a little blood from him. In the distressed eyes of Ling Li and Fang Yuan, he put it in the center of the tactical matrix. Instantly, the extremely horrible momentum rose from Su Bu Wang and turned into a spiritual pillar. 100,000 people with broken life rings instantly turned into blood mist. The blood mist surrounded the spiritual pillar and broke the bounded domain. The blood mist spread around and exposed the secret place of the spiritual realm on the plane of illusion. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The wind raged like a fierce tiger. Even with Fang Yuan and Ling Li's cultivation, they felt difficult to breathe and couldn't stand stably. Nian. Ling Li looked at the tactical matrix that had been completely wrapped by the spiritual pillar and couldn't be seen clearly. He shouted in surprise. Fang Yuan, whose cultivation was slightly lower, couldn't even speak. Just as Ling Li was about to rush to the center of the big tactical matrix, a white light suddenly flew out from it. His pupils shrank. He saw what was shot out and immediately stepped forward to catch it. Mother? The white light dissipated. Su Bu Wang tilted his head and looked at him with a pair of innocent big eyes. Ling Li was shocked. At this moment, the old beggar's voice came, "Leave quickly. Otherwise, after the mirror spirit appears, it will never let your son leave alive. Leave the rest to me." Ling Li looked serious. He glanced at Fang Yuan, who was still struggling to resist, and stretched out his hand to grab his shoulder. Just after they were thousands of miles away from the big tactical matrix, the sky suddenly dimmed. Dark clouds rolled, and a furious roar resounded through the world. Chapter 322. As the dark clouds rolled in the sky, a face quickly condensed into shape. "Is that the mirror spirit you mentioned?" Ling Li held his son tightly and looked at the horrible scene in the distance that the sky seemed to crack. He couldn't help feeling numb and cold inside. In addition to demons, how many monsters in the world were there that he didn't know? Fang Yuan gasped, and a trace of fear flashed in his eyes. Then he seemed to think of something. He grabbed Ling Li and transmitted the sound quickly, "Run." Before the transmission was finished, Ling Li, who had sensed it, had already taken Fang Yuan to run away. Shortly after they left, the source of the tactical matrix suddenly cracked, and dark cracks appeared. Then it collapsed inward with a bang, forming a huge vortex that covered the sky and the sun. A strong suction was generated from it, and countless land and vegetation were swallowed by it. In the twinkling of an eye, tens of thousands of miles around Fang Yuan became a void. "Who?" Ling Li gasped violently, and his forehead was full of cold sweat. He looked at the space that completely disappeared in front of him in horror, and the silent horror began to spread. Break the world. This world is really going to be broken. Did the old beggar do it? Then, Ling Li looked around and tried to find. Where's Suli? Suli. Before he finished his words, suddenly, boom! From the dark void, the loud sound almost broke the eardrum. Lingli was so shocked that he quickly protected his son. But even so, Su Buwang's eyes were shocked with blood, and he burst into tears. No, the new impact range is larger, and it's not safe here. Fang Yuan's face changed, and he rushed away. Lingli could only temporarily put aside his thoughts and speed up to keep up. No one knew the result of the battle in the void later. Several months later, all the changes were just like the rumors circulating in the streets. In the azure sky, the pitch-black void gradually spread, and in the end, swallowed everything. Only a few dangerous places known as the continent's perilous lands were still struggling to hold on, and the number of survivors was less than 1,000. In addition, only a few sub-buildings of the spiritual realm were left, which accommodated many survivors. Soon after, the sound of the mirror breaking resounded through every inch of space in the illusion, and even people hiding in the dangerous places and the boundary could hear it clearly. What's going on? Is the boundary going to be broken? We are going to die. The world has really perished. At the same time that most people were crying out in despair, there was a small group of people who were staring fixedly at the sky, and their eyes seemed to be flickering with a bright light. If someone could decipher the meaning behind those eyes, they would definitely be able to see that the light was called anticipation. Fang Yuan and Lingli were included in this small group of people. However, they didn't have any expectation in their eyes, but were gloomy and complicated. During this time, Lingli had learned the truth from Fang Yuan. According to their situation at the moment, it was not difficult to guess that the old beggar was using them, and Fang Yuan acquiesced. After hearing that, he only kept silent and did not blame Fang Yuan. If Fang Yuan were him, he would do the same. He would not allow any hope to be blocked. After this world is broken, the memories of the soul's original body will return. Lingli looked at his crying son in his arms, and his eyes flashed with tenderness and doting. He didn't understand until now how difficult it was for Suli to give birth to a real child for him. But, if possible, she would rather exchange Su Buwang for a complete Suli. Suddenly, a gust of wind came. Fang Yuan seemed to feel something and looked up. The pitch-dark nothingness was like a curtain at the moment, which was suddenly torn by a giant hand. The sky became azure again, but it was no longer the same sky as before. Soul of the Life Ring, return quickly. This world will be broken, and there will be no vitality. A voice like the morning bell and evening drum suddenly sounded in everyone's ears. Immediately, many people's eyes gradually became confused, and finally became completely absent-minded. They turned into a flash of light and disappeared in the world. As for the creatures that were originally in the illusion, they disappeared the moment the void was broken. Ha 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 ha, I didn't expect that I would see the light of day again. Standing in the crowd, the inconspicuous middle-aged scholar suddenly laughed and shot to the broken nothingness. He disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. Those nothingness turbulence that could destroy everything did not cause any harm to him. Mother? Su Buwang looked curiously at Lingli, who closed his eyes, and then tilted his head to look at Fang Yuan, whose face also changed as if falling into a nightmare. He struggled to come out and touch Fang Yuan's face, but Lingli held him so tightly that he couldn't get rid of him. Rumble! There was a loud sound of the land collapsing in the nothingness. If Fang Yuan was still awake at the moment, he must be able to distinguish the direction, which was the several boundaries of the spiritual realm. But now, the two of them had no time to care about the safety of Chu Qingning and others. 2 hours later, a loud sound resounded by their ears. It turned out that a portion of this danger zone had caved in, and only 70% of its original size remained. Following that, a continuous sound of shattering resounded. If someone was awake at this moment, they would be able to see this danger zone shattering bit by bit. At a certain moment, as another flash of light left the center of the secluded place with a laugh, the speed of the dangerous place falling immediately accelerated several times. In the blink of an eye, there was only a space of 300 meters around Ling Li and Fang Yuan. At this moment, Fang Yuan's closed eyes suddenly opened. His eyes had changed a lot, and he couldn't find much familiarity with Fang Yuan anymore. He moved his eyes to the right and fell on Ling Li, who was still recovering his memory. A deep hatred immediately appeared in his eyes. This kind of hatred was no longer as soft and hesitant as before, but unforgettable, as if it would not stop until one of them died. Now was the best time to take action. Fang Yuan's fingers touched the hilt of the sword, and his center of gravity shifted down. When he was about to draw the sword, he suddenly heard a voice of doubt. "Mother?" A childish voice suddenly sounded. Fang Yuan's movements suddenly stopped, and his eyes fell on Su Buwang. His eyes immediately showed the meaning of struggle, but the killing intent in his heart had faded. He had tried his best to ignore the existence of this little guy, but unfortunately, man proposes, God disposes. Since he heard the word mother, he knew that at least now, he couldn't kill Ling Li. Then, after a few seconds, Ling Li took a deep breath, and his eyelashes trembled. Finally, he opened his eyes, and his temperament changed dramatically in an instant. He was less righteous than before, and more evil and gloomy. Fang Yuan was immediately on guard. If the original Ling Li was just a pool of clear water, then now, the young man standing in front of him holding Su Buwang had become like a deep sea, unpredictable. The first moment Ling Li opened his eyes, he fell on Su Buwang, who was still struggling in his arms. His evil eyes immediately converged and turned into a little softness. After gently teasing Su Buwang's little face a few times, he stopped and suddenly raised his head. Fang Yuan's breath instantly stopped. Although he was expressionless, it was not difficult to see that he was nervous. Ling Li raised his evil eyebrows, like a sharp sword piercing the clouds, which made Fang Yuan's face turn pale. He couldn't help but step back to the edge of the danger zone. If he took another step, he would fall into the nothingness and be doomed eternally. But even so, Fang Yuan sadly found that the pressure of the nothingness behind him was not as great as that of Ling Li in front of him. Sure enough, he deserved his reputation. "It should be the first time for me to see you." Ling Li slightly raised the corners of his mouth, and he was extremely calm, as if the anxiety and madness brought by Su Li had left him. He said lightly, "But you want to kill me. It was a good opportunity just now, but you didn't do it. Is it because of the woman who courted her own death?" Or, speaking of this, Ling Li just glanced at Su Buwang in his arms, and his indifferent tone was full of sarcasm. "You are really a sentimental person?" Fang Yuan's face changed slightly. His right hand trembled violently, and the long sword buzzed. How could he say that about Su Li? He changed. How could he be so fast? Even if he was, he shouldn't forget all the influences in this world in just a few seconds. If he had known this, he should kill him. But he also knew that even if he did it now, he had no chance. The opportunity left for him just now had already disappeared. Ling Li calmly looked at Fang Yuan's changing expression. Seeing that Fang Yuan always restrained himself and didn't dare to act rashly, a trace of boredom appeared on Ling Li's face. "Oh, you still don't dare? There are countless people in this cultivation circle who want to kill me. You don't matter. Today, for the sake that you didn't do it, I will spare your life." While speaking, Ling Li disappeared with Su Buwang like smoke, and the last sentence slowly sounded in the nothingness. "Next time. Don't even have the courage to do it. Ha ha ha." Ling Li looked at the direction of the voice, and his lips almost bled from biting. "Ling Li, if I become an immortal, you will die." Rumble. As soon as he said this, the last foothold also shattered into powder, and Fang Yuan was immediately thrown into the nothingness. Just when this pair of big hands finally broke through the black curtain and fished out Fang Yuan, the illusion of reincarnation finally completely returned to nothingness and became history. In the rapid movement of the giant hands, Fang Yuan could hardly open his eyes because of the fierce wind, but he still tried his best to open his eyes and see where the giant hands were going to take him. With a glimpse, Fang Yuan suddenly froze, because he finally saw the whole picture of the reincarnation mirror. It was really just an ordinary mirror that was only the size of a palm. Although the patterns on it were simple and unadorned, they weren't rare. After so many years of twists and turns, it was actually in this mirror. How vast the world was and how small it was. Bang, 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 bang. Just when Fang Yuan was shocked, suddenly a series of cracking sounds sounded, just like what he heard in the illusion before. Fang Yuan fixed his eyes and then saw the spiritual circle, which was called the ancient treasure, cracked like a spider web. Then with a bang, it was completely broken into many pieces and scattered into the endless nothingness. Chapter 323. Qingshui Circle. This was a world that had existed for more than hundreds of millions of years. The origin of the world had long been untraceable. Only in the ancient mythological books collected by various cultivation sects could it be found sporadically. But the only thing that could be confirmed was that there had been a sage in this world. After hundreds of millions of years of development, the whole Qingshui Circle consisted of 3 provinces, hundreds of large regions, and many overseas islands. Cultivation was prevalent, and there were countless large and small sections. Jojo region was just an inconspicuous small region among hundreds of large regions. However, in the past 1,000 years, the name of Jojo region was well known. Even the top cultivation forces in Shaanxi province knew this name. In the entire Qingshui Circle, anyone who had a little understanding of cultivation affairs would be familiar with this name. Not for anything else, but because it was the source of the bloody accident of samsara that killed countless cultivation geniuses in major sects. Back then, the first holy girl of Yushu sect opened the reincarnation mirror, and countless talents entered it to compete for opportunities. Every time I think of all kinds of grand occasions, I feel excited. But hundreds of years later, the treasure reincarnation only reached the 2nd level. A large number of cultivation geniuses and future giants died in it, and their souls were destroyed. All the major sects were in a panic and gathered in one place to find a solution. But in less than a year, the remaining 99% of the geniuses in the reincarnation mirror died. On that day, the sky of our Jojo region was blood red. Unfortunately, in the end, the reincarnation mirror collapsed by itself and broke into countless pieces and scattered in all circles. No one could know the truth of that year. Next to a low and dilapidated village, under a shady big banyan tree, a white-bearded old man in a patched coat was holding a cattail leaf fan. He couldn't help sighing, as if he was recalling the tragic situation of that year, and the wrinkles on his face were all bunched up. In front of him, several little radishes, who seemed to be no more than 4 or 5 years old, tilted their heads and blinked with a puzzled look. However, they were still full of interest, squatting beside the old man and unwilling to leave. There were no cultivators in the village, and only the young men in the family practiced martial arts. There were no teachers either. The funniest person in the village was the old farmer who liked to talk about immortals. However, the things that the old farmer said were interesting to the adults in the village at first, and they treated it as a fairy tale. Later, the old farmer said it too many times, and it was inevitable that people would get annoyed. As a result, after several years, as long as the old farmer sat down and wanted to say something, the other villagers would find an excuse to leave. Only a group of children would never get tired of it. However, despite this being the case, the old farmer still said it again and again. Regardless of whether others heard it or not, he had to say it for himself to hear. If he didn't say it, then the pain in his heart would be impossible to get rid of, and he would go mad from resentment. The old farmer took this to heart and never mentioned it to anyone. "Old Huang, you're still going on and on about it?" All the sweet potatoes in your field have been stolen by Buttface, who lives by the river. When the woman who came out to feed the chickens saw the situation under the tree, an unhappy expression flashed across her face. She immediately shouted loudly. The old farmer's complexion immediately changed. He staggered as he got up. He didn't care that he had lost a straw shoe and ran towards his sweet potato field, causing the children to burst into laughter. After the old farmer left, the children felt quite bored. A group of children ran to the woman, and a little fat boy jumped out and hugged her, calling her mother coquettishly. The woman immediately beamed with joy. Seeing that most of the other families were girls, she was quite complacent. She didn't forget to warn her son, Daniel, don't listen to Grandpa Huang. Yes, everything he said was a lie. I know. The little fat boy nodded his head obediently. Then he couldn't help but ask curiously, Mother, are there really immortals in this world? What is the cultivation that Grandpa Huang mentioned? The woman rolled her eyes. If there are so many immortals, why is your Grandpa Huang still farming in our village? Don't talk about cultivation. Go back and practice your strength, or how can you be a hunter in the future? Oh, the little fat boy responded and was no longer curious. The woman looked at the remaining girls who hadn't left. She turned into the house and took out a bag of dried sweet potatoes. Maybe one of them would be her son's daughter-in-law in the future. It was always good to leave a good impression. However, when she got to the last girl, the smile on her face immediately faded. She fumbled around in the bag and only took out one sweet potato. In the end, she seemed to think it was too much, so she added another sweet potato and placed it in the girl's hand. You little girl, don't play around. Go back and take care of your father. The girl lowered her head and silently put away the dried sweet potato. She didn't say anything and left. She was heading for her home. Seeing her go far, the woman withdrew her gaze. Her face immediately became stern. She pulled her son's ear and scolded, How many times have I told you? Don't play with this jinx. Why don't you listen to me? The little fat boy was dissatisfied this time and shouted, Mother, isn't Arya a little ugly? She is a good person and often goes to the mountain to bring snacks for us. Why don't you let me play with her? The woman immediately got angry. She grabbed the little fat boy and began to spank him. Are you still not obedient? When did I hurt you? In that area, how can she be ugly? If you play with her again, other brothers and sisters will not play with you. The little fat boy was beaten and cried. Coupled with the serious consequences his mother said, he suddenly shouted, Mother, stop it, Dad. Come and save me. I won't play with Arya anymore. At this moment, in front of the sweet potato field, Huang stopped on the ridge of the field panting. His face was as black as the bottom of a pot. All the sweet potatoes in the field were not missing. The little wife of the Zhang family was really eloquent. What she said seemed to be true, which almost made him run half to death. Well, I'll talk to the old boy of the Zhang family later. After 2 breaths, Huang turned around and was about to go back, but he found another thin girl standing on the ridge of the field. The little girl's skin was very white, as if the fierce sunlight couldn't leave a single trace on her body. However, this kind of whiteness was mostly due to malnutrition. Her thin and small body gave the illusion that she could be crushed with one hand. She was so thin that she did not look like a child of 7 or 8 years old at all, so she still mingled with children of 4 or 5 years old. But even so, the crisscrossing, spider web-like scars on her face still made it impossible for her to find a playmate. The atmosphere was silent for a while. Huang was surprised. The iconic scars on her face quickly reminded him who the little girl in front of him was. Aren't you Arya from the east side of the river? Arya nodded and rarely said, Grandpa, can you tell me the story of the first holy girl of Yushu sect again? At this time, Huang was surprised to find that Arya's voice was not as rough as that of her mother, who was transferred to another family. Instead, it was like the sound of an empty valley, sweet and beautiful. At least, Huang had never heard such a beautiful voice in the area where mortals lived in his life except in that place. But seeing the scars on Arya's face, Huang shook his head regretfully and did not say much. He sat on the ridge, patted the place beside him, and said kindly, Come and sit down. I will tell you. You are the first one who is not tired of listening to me for 3 years. In this respect, you are better than Antley in the village. From 4 years old to 7 years old, the child still wanted to listen, which surprised Huang himself. Arya seemed to hear that Huang was praising her, and a smile appeared on her face. But the scars moved with the smile, which was more terrible than not smiling. After all, Huang was a person who had seen the big world. Seeing this, he did not show any different expression. Instead, he pondered for a moment and laughed in a low voice. For the sake of listening to my story for 3 years, I will tell you something different this time. But what I tell you today, you can't tell others. Can you do that? Arya nodded. She had no friends. As for her father, it was even more impossible for her to tell him anything. Huang seemed to understand this and quickly got into the mood. He gritted his teeth and said, "Actually, in those days, I was an ordinary handyman of Yushu sect, and I was on the mount of the first holy girl." Arya showed curiosity. She did not understand why she was interested in these things, but children would not think so much. She wanted to know, so she came to listen. Obviously, Huang would tell her more stories today. Huang seemed to be lost in memories, and his eyes were full of fanaticism and longing. The world of immortals is beyond the imagination of mortals. They fly in the sky and are omnipotent. But those immortals do not call themselves immortals, but call themselves cultivators. More commonly, they call themselves practitioners. I didn't know this until I joined the sect. The first holy girl of Yushu sect was really a fairy-like figure. In those days, Huang had a great time talking, and Arya was also fascinated. Time passed quickly, and soon it was dark. Huang had no choice but to postpone the story. After sending Arya to the east side of the river, he turned home. Arya's family lived in the east side of the river. If he did not send her home, he would not be at ease. He had lived alone for a long time these years and felt too lonely. In addition, Arya was not tired of his nagging, so he had the idea of adopting her. However, every time he thought of Arya's troublesome father, Huang could only give up. In the east side of the river, there were mostly wastelands, and only one piece of land was reclaimed, which was the one in front of Arya's family. More than 10 years ago, there were more villagers in the east side of the river than in the west side of the river. But because of many disasters, only Arya's family stayed in the east side of the river. Squeak. In front of the earthen courtyard covered with thatch, Arya carefully pushed the door open and poked her head in. Her ears and eyes were faintly filled with panic and fear. Seeing that there was no one in the courtyard, Arya breathed a sigh of relief. She rushed in, closed the door, and walked to the earthen stove in the corner of the courtyard to start a fire to cook. But before the fire could be ignited, a faint voice filled with anger suddenly rang out. Chapter 324. Hearing the sound, Arya was so scared that her body trembled. The firewood in her hands scattered on the ground, but she didn't pick it up. Instead, she stepped over the firewood and ran away. Behind her, the man with a hideous scar on his face limped to her. He looked like a ferocious ghost. "How dare you run away? You are a loser. You still want to find that bitch?" Arya shook her head in horror, but the man was still excited. He bent down to pick up a firewood on the ground and smashed it at Arya's head. "Today, I will beat you to death, you loser." Ah! Arya let out a scream of horror. Fortunately, she reacted quickly and dodged with her flexible and petite body. The firewood smashed on the ground and broke into 2 pieces. The sound made Arya's heart tremble. If it hit her, it must be very painful. She didn't want to feel pain anymore. "Daddy, I didn't mean it." Arya ran around the yard and begged. Arya was just playing and delayed the time. "I won't do it again. Daddy, please spare my life." You are lying. You just want to run away. That bitch left me. Do you want me to die so that you can rely on her? You come back so late to cook. Do you want me to starve to death? As the man said, a red madness appeared in his eyes. He turned back and tightened the door bolt, continuing to chase and beat Arya. Although Arya was flexible, she was still young and couldn't take big steps. In the end, she gradually ran out of strength and was caught and beaten violently. Cry. You only know how to cry. Go and cook for me. Clang. The man swung the stick and the madness in his eyes faded away. He turned back to the house. Arya hugged her knees and curled up in the corner of the mud wall. She sobbed in a low voice and wiped the blood on her arms with her small hands. When the man's voice came again in the house, she had to bear the pain in her body and got up to make a fire to cook. Hiss! The cold well water soaked her small hands. Arya took a deep breath and felt the pain in the wounds on her hands lessen. Then she began to wash the rice. The blood in the wounds inevitably flowed into the water, but soon it was diluted and invisible. Suddenly, she was slightly stunned. Just now, she seemed to see a wisp of black air flashing in the rice water. It condensed into a dot and finally bloomed like a black lotus. Illusion? The young girl didn't think too much about it. She blinked her eyes in confusion and continued to wash the rice. Being beaten, begging for mercy, working. This scene seemed to be repeated every few days. The only difference was that the man's temperament became more and more violent. When he was angry, his eyes would be scarlet red and he would lose his mind. When it was serious, he wouldn't even know what he was doing. He was like a bottle that was about to be filled to the brim with sand. Every day, sand was forcibly stuffed into the bottle. One day in the future, when the sand reached a certain limit, the bottle would definitely crack open. The man who was deeply involved did not notice the cause of such a situation. The young and ignorant Arya did not even have the slightest association. She just obediently obeyed her horrible biological father every day. Early the next morning, the rooster crowed from the west side of the river. Arya, who was half asleep, immediately got up to make breakfast. The painful memory of yesterday was still very clear. After making breakfast, she opened the door but did not find her father's limping figure. When she was wondering, suddenly there was a burst of messy footsteps outside the door. Arya looked back and immediately saw Huang, who told her a story yesterday, and several respectable old people in the village. Looking at Arya holding the breakfast with a confused look on her face, a faint pity flashed across the faces of the few old people, but it soon disappeared. Although they were the good people in the village, no one wanted to touch this ugly little girl. Well, Huang, take her to kowtow to her father first. The village head standing in the middle said, turned around and left, and then the rest also left. Huang snorted, and sarcasm flashed in his eyes. When he looked back and saw Arya, he walked in slowly and picked her up. Girl, your life is really hard. You will live with your grandpa in the future. What happened to my father? Arya asked cautiously, with a well-hidden expectation in her eyes. Huang sighed. It seems that he knocked his foot last night. Your father fell into the river and drowned. One day later, with the help of many villagers, there was a new grave on the top of the hill. Arya, dressed in linen clothes, cried her heart out. Her voice could be heard from far away, which made many farmers watching from a distance feel sorry for her. This girl is so pitiful. She has never encountered a good thing since she was born. Otherwise, why is she called a jinx? She has just died. Don't say a few words. The woman immediately shut up. She didn't want to be possessed by a ghost in the middle of the night. The village head, leaning on his crutch, looked at Huang standing behind Arya and comforted her gently. He shook his head and sighed. Fortunately, Huang is willing to adopt this girl. She is blessed. Everyone immediately echoed. Everyone knows Su Silin's bad temper. When his mother and wife were still alive, he often beat his mother. How could we, a girl, bear it? If she hadn't run away with a wild man, I'm afraid that she would have died of anger like Su Silin's mother. Angered to death? Someone sneered. Who knows whether she was angered to death or beaten to death. After Su Silin's mother died, he immediately cremated her. Obviously, he had a guilty conscience. I think the plague 7 years ago must have something to do with Su Silin. The unfilial son was struck by lightning, and so many neighbors were implicated. The more people talked, the more excited they were. They didn't notice that the old man and the young girl had come down from the mountain. Huang was confused and couldn't help but ask, "What are you talking about?" As soon as they saw Arya, there was an instant silence, and the atmosphere became strange. The village head's face trembled, and a trace of unnaturalness flashed through his eyes. He tried to avoid Arya's innocent eyes and looked at Huang, saying, "When these things happened, you had not come to our village. I will tell you the details later. You see, Arya is tired. Go back and have a rest." Huang nodded and nodded. "Then I will see you in the evening." The village head nodded and watched Huang leave with Arya. A group of villagers immediately surrounded him and said hurriedly, "Village head, you can't say what happened 7 years ago." "Yes." The fat boy's mother echoed, "Village head, think about it. If you tell Huang what happened 7 years ago, he will definitely think of Arya. If he doesn't want Arya, you will suffer. If none of us raises her and she dies, your position as the village head will come to an end." Enough. Seeing that they were going too far, Elder Li's face turned red with anger. He slammed his crutch on the ground and said in a deep voice, "I know what I'm doing. Even if something happens, it won't be your turn to be in trouble. Disperse." The fat boy's mother rolled her eyes and was not afraid of the village head at all. "Our kindness is regarded as ill intent. Let's go." The remaining women also said a few words in a strange tone before turning around and leaving. "Old village head, they are all narrow-minded. Please don't take it to heart. Yes, they are all women. They are not sensible." The only hunters in the village comforted him and left one after another. Only the village head stood there with a gloomy look. No one knew what he was thinking. When Huang took Arya back to his home, Arya immediately ran to the stove and was ready to work. Huang was so scared that he picked Arya up and scolded, "What do you want to do? My stove can't stand your tossing. Go and play. I'll cook." Arya's eyes became watery instantly. Huang was confused. Finally, he heard Arya said in tears, "Grandpa, I can cook. I can go up the mountain to collect firewood. I can do everything. Grandpa, don't leave me." Huang was stunned and looked at the little girl who was picked up by him. He didn't do anything. Why did she think that he didn't want her? Suddenly, he fixed his eyes and saw the wounds on Arya's hands. His face immediately became gloomy. He sat down with Arya in his arms and opened the linen covering her wrists. Sure enough, just like his face, he was covered in scars, and many of them were fresh. "Son of a bitch. If I had known, I would." He couldn't help cursing and immediately felt guilty. There were too many wounds on Arya's face. Besides, the girl usually wrapped herself tightly, so he didn't notice it. "Little girl, Grandpa will never abandon you. You will follow me in the future. As long as I can do it, you don't have to do any rough work. You can learn needlework like other girls. Oh, by the way, I can read. I will teach you to read." The night was as cold as water. On the newly arranged bed, Arya had fallen asleep peacefully. There were still tears in her eyes, but she didn't panic after being comforted by Huang. Huang chuckled, and an unprecedented sense of warmth rose in his heart. He spent most of his life in Yushu sect in order to seek immortality and learn the Tao. His relatives had long died or separated, not to mention getting married and having children. Now he suddenly had a granddaughter. Huang really wanted to leave all the good things to her. It's almost time. Let's see what Oldly will say. 7 years ago, the girl was just born. What happened at that time? With doubts, Huang gently closed the door and turned to the old village head's house. Soon, Huang came to the old village head's fence and saw the village head sitting on a stone stool outside the house, waiting for him with a lighted candle. Seeing Huang, the village head nodded and said, "Come in, the door is open." After Huang pushed the door and sat down, the village head looked at him deeply. Seeing the remaining joy on his face, he seemed to understand something. He didn't confirm anything and said directly, Chapter 325. 10 years ago, in Tia village, Su Silin became the best hunter in the village by virtue of his strength and married his wife, Xiao Wei. He lived a good life. Although he was a little grumpy, he didn't beat his wife and mother. After a year of marriage, Xiao Wei was pregnant, which made Su Silin very happy. Su's mother even told everyone she met that her daughter-in-law was pregnant and would definitely give birth to a big fat boy. Maybe because she said too much and violated the taboo, Xiao Wei finally gave birth to a daughter. Although Su Silin and Su's mother were not very happy, they didn't show it. Then, less than a year later, Xiao Wei was pregnant with the second child. This time, Su Silin and his mother didn't say a word, waiting for the birth of the child in Xiao Wei's belly. But this time, it was a daughter. Su Silin finally got angry and didn't even bother to name the child. He beat his wife, who was still weak. When they quarreled, the fine jewelry scratched the second daughter's face, and the blood was everywhere. Recalling this, the village head sighed, "This is Area." Later, the villagers went to mediate and kindly cleaned his family, but Xiao Wei was disheartened and took her eldest daughter back to her mother's home. Later, I heard that she remarried and there was no news of her. Su Silin's mother died of anger not long after that. Just a few days after that day, the people on the east side of the river were infected with the plague, and everyone was crazy and had a bad temper. All the clinics in the town were occupied by our village. It took about half a year for the illness of the people on the east side of the river to get better. After getting better, they moved away one by one. In less than a month, all of them left, except Su Silin's family. It's strange that Area was just born at that time. She should be the most susceptible to infection, but she was the only one who didn't get sick. I sent her to the nanny in the village to drink milk. She was very obedient. Maybe it was God's pity for her. Huang nodded with a gloomy face. In this way, since the girl was born, she had suffered many misfortunes and never had a good day. Oldly, I understand what you're saying. Huang clapped his hands on his thighs and said in a deep voice, "Area has had a hard life since she was a child, and I have been alone all my life. It's best for us to be companions. As long as I am alive, I will never let her suffer." Village Chiefly was overjoyed when he heard that. He finally got rid of one of his worries. "It can't be better that you think so. Area is so lucky." Huang responded and did not say anything else. They chatted for a while and then went home. The next morning, Area woke up and sat up from the bed. She was stunned for a moment before she realized that she was no longer in the east of the river. Her biological father was dead. Now, Area thought of something. She suddenly jumped out of bed and ran out barefoot. The morning sun shone into the yard through the mist. Area saw Huang, who was about to make breakfast, at a glance. Her bright eyes flashed with light and she shouted, "Grandpa!" Huang shivered and almost put his hand in the fire. He looked up and saw Area. He couldn't help but grin. He immediately came over and scolded her with a smile. "You little girl, the ground is so cold. Why don't you wear shoes?" Area just giggled and said nothing. Huang was happy to see her. She was indeed a child. It seemed that her father's death had no effect on her. "Girl, Grandpa will give you a name today. Okay?" Huang sat on the threshold with Area in his arms. "Area is your nickname. I will send you to school in the future. You can't always be called this name." Area nodded obediently. Her pretty eyes were full of expectation. "Grandpa, please give me a name." Huang grinned and immediately thought hard. His brows knitted together. However, although he had some unusual experiences, he was uneducated. It was very difficult for him to think of a name suddenly. Your father's surname is Su. Although he doesn't treat you well, you still need this surname, Huang muttered. Suddenly, his eyes lit up and his heart, which had been silent for a long time, suddenly beat vigorously. There was no doubt that there was a bold idea in his mind at this moment. But as soon as this idea came up, he could no longer suppress it. There was a custom in the village. If a child was weak and sick when he was young, he should give him a cheap name so that he could be fed. Therefore, there were many people named Ergo Z or Sherdan in the village. But if he had a bad life like Area, he should give him a great name to change his life. What was the greatest name? And the surname was Su. There was only one candidate in Huang's mind. Although the owner of the Mount of Holy Girl of Yushu sect had changed when he went up the mountain decades ago, and most of what he said to Area was bragging, but he remembered the legendary name very clearly. This name is a taboo in the cultivation circle, but Area is just a mortal, and there are so many people with the same name. Huang's eyes became brighter and brighter. Finally, he made up his mind and said, Area, you will be called Suli from now on. Li as in hearty. Boom. Suli. This name. Area's mind was blank, and her face became pale at a speed visible to the naked eye. Her lips trembled, and she let out a shrill howl. She held her head and kept shouting, Suli, Suli, leanly, leanly, lingly. Huang saw that Area was stimulated, and his face changed with fear. Girl, what's wrong with you? Don't scare me. It's my fault not to call you Suli, Area. Looking at Area, who was getting more and more strange, Huang panicked for a moment and finally reacted. He held Area and went to the clinic. At this moment, Area suddenly calmed down, stopped talking, and stopped trembling. Everything returned to normal. Huang was confused. He put down Area and looked up and down at Area, who closed her eyes. He really didn't know why a name could make Area have such a big reaction. At this moment, Area suddenly opened her eyes. Her pupils were dark, as deep as the starry sky. I am Su Li. She suddenly opened her mouth and her childish voice sounded again. It was more stable than before, but Huang, who had only been in contact with her for a short time, did not notice it. Instead, he nodded and said happily, Let's go. Yes, you are Su Li. At this moment, he not only didn't worry, but also felt lucky for his decision. Area's appearance just now was mostly the blessing of the great holy girl. All kinds of magic in the cultivation circle were really beyond his estimation. Grandpa, I'm a little tired, and I want to rest for a while, Su Li said after a moment of silence. Huang didn't doubt her and nodded. Go ahead. You are growing up. Sleep more. I will call you when I cook breakfast. Su Li responded and turned back. Her pace was no longer brisk. Although Huang felt that something was wrong, he was happy, so he didn't care much about it. He turned around and went to work. Su Li returned to the room and looked at the newly made bed. She frowned and didn't say anything. After a long time, she stretched out her hand and pricked the Naguan acupoint on her wrist. Then, nothing happened. It seems that I have really left the reincarnation mirror and returned to Qingshui Circle. Su Li, who had just recovered her memory, was confused again. Her soul had been destroyed in front of the spirit of the reincarnation mirror, and there was no possibility of reincarnation. But now she not only reincarnated, but also fully recovered her memory. What happened on Earth? After a while of contemplation, Huang's voice sounded outside the house. She had to put aside distractions for a while, and her eyes flashed. No matter what, she had to get through the current predicament first. This body was too weak, and a little bigger danger could make her return to nothingness. This feeling was not very good. Huang mostly planted sweet potatoes, so he only had sweet potato porridge for breakfast. After breakfast, Huang went to work in the field, leaving Su Li alone at home, which gave her enough time to think. It is not difficult to guess what Huang said. This place is not far from Yushu sect, but people in Tieha village obviously have not contacted cultivators. This place is extremely remote, and the threat is only at the level of wild beasts, which gives me a chance to recover. Thinking of this, Suli touched the position of the ring finger of her right hand. She could feel that the ring was still there, but it couldn't be revealed because she didn't have cultivation. Black Lotus Ring of Ghost Clan. Did she take me to reincarnate? This thought inevitably arose in her mind, and Suli thought of all the things that happened in the east of the river before. After recovering her memory, the power of her soul soared, and she remembered every detail since she was born clearly. The desolation in the east of the river, the plague, and the violent death of Su Silin and others were all caused by her blood. Her blood seemed to be related to Black Lotus Ring, and it had all kinds of unpredictable and strange characteristics. It might be right to be called the Jinx. Thinking of this, Suli smiled and didn't feel guilty. If Su Silin took care of her carefully, there would not be so many disasters in the east of the river. It could only be said that karma was not good. Stepping on the path of cultivation again, I know the most complete method of cultivation in this life. Sitting cross-legged in the room, Suli meditated and said nothing. Yushu sect had Yushu tactics, which was a rare mental method in the cultivation circle. Although she was a talented genius in the past, it was absolutely difficult for her to cultivate the top-grade Jindan realm in just 600 years without a good mental method. In this life, she obviously had a better choice. I was trapped in the mirror at that time, and I didn't know it. I only thought that AO sword skills was a unique skill. Now it seems that it is a top holy method of cultivation that integrates mental method and swordsmanship into one. Maybe I can use it as the foundation in this life. Ghost Valley Meditation Direction is also a holy method of cultivation, but it specializes in healing, and its power is too low. If I practice this method, I can only be controlled by others, which is not what I want. Most of the practice methods collected in other reincarnation mirror were superior mental methods, and many of them were holy methods. Holy method. It was extremely rare in the top sects in Qingshui Circle. It could be seen how valuable the mental method of reincarnation mirror was. No wonder so many people were jealous of it. Suli sighed softly, and several figures flashed through her mind. Then she shook her head gently to get rid of the distracting thoughts, and stood up to make the starting gesture of AO sword skills. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.